Okay, good evening. Welcome, and thank you all for coming this evening. I'm Lorraine Carafel. I'm the interim director of the Parsons Cooper Hewitt Master's Program in the History of Design and Curatorial Studies. And this evening we are hosting the Catherine Hoover Vorsanger keynote address. This is followed tomorrow by our annual Graduate Student Symposium, showcasing outstanding research in the history of design. And our theme this year, as you can see, is Made in New York. To start the evening, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce Caroline Bauman, Director of the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. I love short introductions like that. And I'm really, really honored also to welcome all of you and impressed because today is really the first true day of spring and our garden is blossoming with blooms and people. So welcome to the 27th Annual Parsons Cooper Hewitt Graduate Student Symposium on the History of Design, 27 years. For 36 years, Cooper Hewitt and Parsons have educated up-and-coming design scholars, educators, and museum professionals through our joint master's program in the history of design and curatorial studies. Housed in America's Design Museum, this is the only graduate program of its kind in the United States, and something we're very proud of. A wonderful aspect of the program is just how students are embedded throughout Cooper Hewitt's dynamic campus, where they become essential contributors to the museum's mission to inspire, educate, and empower people through design, and work on everything at Cooper Hewitt, from exhibitions to marketing to research. Taught by the world's leading design scholars and Cooper Hewitt's stellar curatorial staff, students are actively engaged in expanding knowledge of design and material culture. The Senses, Design Beyond Vision, just opened in the Barbara and Morton Mandel Design Gallery to great critical excitement. I hope you saw the full page in the New York Times last Friday. And the exhibition was co-curated by master's program graduate Andrea Lips, today our assistant curator of contemporary design, with crucial support from students Adele Bourbon and Bingli Yan. Students also benefit from access to the ultimate teaching resource, Cooper Hewitt's collection of over 210,000 design objects, spanning 30 centuries of design and decorative arts history, with significant holdings of prototypes, process drawings, rare theoretical texts, sample books, tools, and more to inform object research and interpretation. We actively promote our students' findings and writings. Student scholarship is published on our collection's website, in our Object of the Day blog series, and in Objective, which is at the doorway, the master's program Beautiful Journal. The annual Vorsanger Symposium invites important design historians and graduate students of design history from around the globe to Cooper Hewitt to share their expertise. And I'm proud to share that 3 of our presenters for this year's symposium are current students in the master's program. This year's theme, Made in New York, is really a timely one. You've probably seen the banners and posters and advertising all around town. Next month, Cooper Hewitt will be a cultural partner of New York City's borough-wide NYC by Design, a celebration of the city as a global hub of design innovation. So enjoy the symposium, be inspired, and may we see you often and regularly at Cooper Hewitt. Now please join me in welcoming Ethan Roby, Assistant Professor of the History of Decorative Art and Design, to the podium.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thank you for that lovely introduction to what we do here in the master's program. I'm here merely to introduce our next speaker. As you know, this is the Catherine Hoover Vorsanger keynote address, starting off our annual symposium, funded in the memory of our dear departed Catherine Vorsanger, who taught here for many years. And I'd like to introduce now Barry Harwood, Curator of Decorative Arts at the Brooklyn Museum, longtime faculty here in the Parsons Cooper Hewitt Master's Program, and a friend of the late Catherine Vorsanger. So Barry will say a few words about the woman in whose name we are gathered this evening.
Well, good evening. It's always a pleasure, but it's also somewhat sad for me to address you. Catherine was far more than just a really valued colleague. She was really, really a great friend. And at the end of her life, just a year before she died, she was diagnosed with cancer, and then, as fate would have it, a matter of weeks later, I was as well. And so that last year brought us closer than we had been. And so this is always a very poignant moment for me. But it is also a time for us to celebrate Catherine and to remember her wonderful contributions. So, Catherine was a graduate of Smith College and earned her master's and PhD degrees from the City University of New York. She began her career as an assistant curator of fine arts and exhibitions at the California Historical Society in her native San Francisco. In 1979, Catherine moved to New York, and in 1983 joined the staff of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. At the Metropolitan, she distinguished herself by participation in an impressive series of award-winning exhibitions and publications, including co-authorship of Herder Brothers, Furniture and Interiors for a Gilded Age, and as one of the authors and coordinators of the seminal Art in the Empire City, New York, 1825 to 61. In addition, she contributed to American Paradise, The World of the Hudson River School, in 1988. And she organized the decorative arts of Frank Lloyd Wright in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1994, and coordinated the original updating and computerization of the thousands of objects in the Henry R. Luce Center for the Study of American Art that opened in 1989. Catherine's Dictionary of Architects, Artisans, Artists, and Manufacturers in the catalog for the 1987 exhibition In Pursuit of Beauty has become the standard reference for the field of late 19th century American design. As curator in the Department of American Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan, Catherine was responsible for the acquisition of a score of masterpieces of American furniture that enrich our artistic community and have brought a greater understanding of the contribution of American cabinet makers to the history of furniture. Catherine lectured widely on American furniture, from her native San Francisco to London, and from Natchez to Newport. She also served as a board member of the Metropolitan chapter of the Victorian Society in America. Catherine's most important academic affiliation was actually here at the Parsons Cooper Hewitt graduate program, and it was her passion as a teacher and collegiality for which she will be most remembered by those who knew and worked with her. In fact, more than once, Catherine sat on the committee to select the student speakers for the very symposium. She always strove to make both her personal intellectual resources and those of the Metropolitan available to students and other scholars. It was this really utterly rare and unique combination of poise, grace, sincerity, amity, humor, and intellectual accomplishments that marked Catherine's all too short career. She is missed, but this annual lecture that now bears her name keeps her memory alive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barry. So, I'll just get this in here. I am now pleased to introduce our keynote speaker. We're very grateful to have Peter Kenny here today to deliver the Catherine Hoover Vorsanger keynote address. One of the foremost scholars of 18th and early 19th century American furniture, Peter worked in the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art for over 3 decades, serving ultimately as the Ruth Bigelow Riston Curator of American Decorative Arts and Administrator of the American Wing. He spearheaded the rehanging, renovation, and reorganization of the American Wing and worked on numerous exhibitions, including Art in the Empire City. His publications include Duncan Fife, Master Cabinet Maker in New York, Honoré Launier, Cabinet Maker from Paris, The Life and Work of a French Ébéniste in Federal New York, which was actually co-written with MA program faculty member Ulrich Leben, and American Kasten, the Dutch-style suburbs of New York and New Jersey, in 1650 to 1800. You can hear why, of course, he's perfect to talk about Made in New York. He's also been a great friend of the Parsons Cooper Hewitt MA program, helping us organize a seminar in the American wing taught by the Met's curators. And of course, his daughter Claire was a beloved member of our team for several years. So after leaving the Met, Peter became the co-president of Classical Americans Home Preservation Trust. The trust is devoted to the preservation and restoration of early 19th century residential American architecture in the neoclassical style and the work of New York furniture makers. So Peter's talk this evening is entitled, I Love New York, an American Furniture Historian's Perspective. So please welcome Peter Kenny.
You got it. Great. Thank you, Ethan, and thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. This is a real treat for me. As Ethan mentioned, my daughter worked here a number of years ago, I think, in Natalia's position, and I hope that the seat still was warm when you arrived, at least. And also because I have known Ethan for many years because of Claire, and also because of Catherine Voersanger, who is a colleague of mine in the American Wing for all the time that I was there. And her passing was very devastating for the American Wing, but I think she passed the baton of scholarship on to many people. And the one thing I'd like to say about Catherine is, many of us are involved with this field, and many of us bring certain skills to it, but Catherine was a researcher beyond compare. This was her great skill, and I am sure that her legacy lives on here at the Cooper Hewitt. There were no stones unturned when Catherine was involved with the project. I felt like a bit of a piker, to be honest with you. But today, what I wanted to talk to you about, they say a keynote address should be inspiring for those who come and kind of set the tone for what's going forward. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a different way of approaching objects, perhaps. Not so different, other people do it, but maybe kind of my way. That's another Frank Sinatra song about New York. You'll see a little bit of New York running through it. One of the reasons I got involved with New York is I'm lazy. I didn't want to travel too far to do any work. I used to go to presentations or sat on the grants committee at the museum for a while for curators who were putting in for research in Egypt and in Central Europe and all over the place. And I really never had any great desire to do that. I was just more or less happy I don't need any money for this. I just got to get myself going and get out there in the field and do it. I'm also of a generation that I couldn't sit at the computer necessarily and do a ton of research because it was just emerging actually when a lot of my research was going on. I find now it's incredibly exciting what you can do, what you can kind of whip up in terms of imagination. And ultimately that's, I think, what I'd like everybody to think about as we talk tonight. It's about imagination, it's about insight. It's about all the objects that are here and really becoming the best object person you can be. That's a funny term. You'll hear it all the time. He's an object person or she's an object person. But what it is this sort of omnivorous approach, this 360-degree look at an object. And a couple words I'll throw around tonight may come to you as a little strange. Maybe you know them already. But I kind of cut my teeth in an era, I think, of study and material culture study in which everybody was really focused on the object as the center of what you were talking about. And so this idea of how to work out from an object and what you can gain in terms of historical perspective, what you can gain in terms of connections to people who visit a museum, so you can say something to them about that rings true. All of these objects that we deal with hold that information for us, and it's very exciting. So tonight what I'm going to do, and I hope this works out all right, is I'm going to take you a little bit on a path with me through the things that I was interested over the years. And along the way, I may dip here and dip there. I didn't write anything out. I don't consider myself a theorist who's going to tell you how to do everything. I consider myself an enthusiast with a great love for American furniture. And New York, as you can see. I love New York. When I first got interested in New York, I think I had these antiquarian dreams. I lived in the Hudson Valley. I thought about Dutch things all the time when I crossed the Rip Van Winkle Bridge going to Hudson, New York, and seeing stepped gables. And, I remembered back to my childhood and stories of, Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. And all of these things were very sort of embedded in me. And I was so interested. And it was because it was this thing that was out there that was so appealing. It was so different than what we had. One of the things that always inspired me was coming to New York and having my parents tell me when I was walking in Lower Manhattan is this is just where Peter Stuyvesant walked. And you can walk those streets in Lower Manhattan. They haven't really changed. It's probably the best artifact of the Dutch time here, or the street grid below Wall Street. So all of that stuff really kind of inspired me. I also think that one of the things that inspired me was some of the work that was going on in Albany with the Netherlands project. So these things actually kind of added up for me and inspired me in certain ways. And I thought I'd have a few objects that really entertained me from this period. And this is one of the early proposals for a seal for the Dutch West India Company for New Amsterdam. And most of the times, you have rampant lions. Rampant, of course, meaning an animal on his hind legs. Here we have rampant beavers. I mean, I think that's a pretty cool thing. And in Dutch below, you'll see it says, who can read Old Dutch here, but it says, this is rejected, basically. This isn't going to fly. But then somebody got the idea, and you see up in the upper corner a rampant lion. So what was New York like? I mean, in this world I was trying to imagine, and this antiquarian sense of how do I get back to the first moment in this place? How do I track furniture that I can actually consider to be from that first generation? Well, it was a rude awakening for me as a scholar to realize that there really is virtually nothing from the earliest period. So you had to begin to come to terms with what is Dutch New York? What is New York Dutch? And once you sort of opened your mind to that, things started to fall in place. But it was a culture and acculturation process that occurred here, and a maturing part on my part to understand what was going on. But trying to study what was in this town, here's a 1650s view of it, was very difficult and continues to be so. This is the Castello plan for New Amsterdam in 1660. And one of the wonderful works that you may have been exposed to over the years is the iconography of Manhattan Island by I.N. Phelps Stokes. And this man took the time to literally to determine who lived on this grid of streets that we see in old New York here, with the one canal on Broad Street running in. It is not the Dutch Golden Age in Amsterdam by any stretch of the imagination, but the street grid that I mentioned before essentially is still there, the Broadway, the wide street, up at the top of the screen. There are people in there doing things. There are people designing things. There are artisans in there. And as a scholar looking at these names, one of the real challenges is, where are the things? Where are the things? Who are the joiners? I'm interested in furniture. Who are the turners? Who are the upholsterers? And they're named names in there. And it's tantalizing to think about it. There also were artifacts that were here that help us to understand and get me really excited about what was going on. So learning New York, on my part, took me on trips to the Brooklyn Museum, Barry's hunting grounds, and here is this incredible Dutch cast that is there that belonged to the Rombouts family, with an early New York history, as Dutch can be, and you can see how similar it is to one in the Peter de Hoek painting. And so I begin to go to lectures and hear stories like, well, you can't trust anything in a Dutch picture. It wasn't really there. It's all a stage set. Well, I guess so, but this thing was here and in somebody's house, and it didn't look like this, but it was in somebody's house, so it was a thing, and it had reality for me. And so finding a few more of these really got me thinking, gee, these were objects of desire, and let's see if we can track into this a little bit more. Of course, their use is what continued in this country, and the cultural aspect of them is what preserved these big architectonic forms within Dutch homes. And here you can see, what's this called? The wise and economical Dutch householder from the 17th century, carefully packing her linens into place. The kind of books that would have been available to the first generation of Dutch who came here. Finding things like this is incredibly difficult. There are basically a handful, 3 or 4 oak Costin from the early period, of oak being, of course, the wood that you want to find for 17th century furniture. The example that I show you here has a marbleized surface on it, which is fascinating, and probably not the original surface on the piece of furniture, but very close to that. This is a piece of furniture that in my desperate search for early New York furniture, I saw an Antiques magazine from the 1930s, I believe, that this was illustrated in. And when I came to the Metropolitan, one of the first things, the most exciting things that ever happened to me there was a note came in to Francis Safford, who was the curator of this early furniture, saying that they had an old Cos up on the Palisades. Would you like to come see it? And she said, knowing my interest, why don't we go together? So we went up along the Palisades, and we discovered in a home of a woman who was an artist and a textile designer of quite some fame. Her name was Davenport, I forget her first name, but she worked for Orson Welles Mercury Theater, and she was a costume designer for them. But she loved this piece of furniture and lived in a small house with this piece of furniture, an open fireplace, a bed, and lots of packs of Camel cigarettes, because when we arrived, none of the painted surfaces were there, but right away the bell went off. I said, oh my goodness, this is that early piece of furniture that was illustrated by Joseph Downs in an article. And so began the discovery process of finding some more of these and starting to put things together. Another extraordinary example from the Art Institute of Chicago that truly is a 17th century piece of furniture. Can we pull it all the way back to that Dutch era? I think it's possible. I think it certainly is possible. And as is the other example I showed you a moment ago, this particular example, as you can see, very closely related to a 1643 published design in Officina Arcularia, a well-known Dutch furniture pattern book. So this piece of furniture, the previous one, really led to a lot of exciting discoveries. And as you unwrap this whole thing, you begin to sort of see make some sense going on here about closeness to the Dutch tradition in American furniture. But by the time we see this piece of furniture emerge, probably around 1710, 20, maybe 30, you still are using design sources like Officina Arcularia for the painted surface on it, but now the object has become part of Dutch New York, not New Netherlands anymore. Once New York is taken over by the English, there's a slow changeover in the way people think and work, and New York Dutch objects become very interesting indeed. These are an iconic object. There are probably 300 or 400 of these that survive. And we sorted through and tried to discover where they were from, tried to discover who the craftsmen were working in the area. And I think we came down on some interesting design features on these. When I say they, I began to work with Gib Vincent from the Cooperstown graduate program on a project, and Francis Safford as well. And we were able to sort of create in our mind what a Dutch New York object is, as opposed to a real, pure, sort of first-generation object. The architecture, the silver, paintings, a number of things have this very distinctive aspect to them, but you'd never call them pure Dutch, but they're Dutch New York. And by that I mean these are made by folks and used by folks who are not just first-generation Dutch, but instead they are descendants of not only Dutch, but French Huguenot, Germanic folks, people who had moved as part of the movement into New Netherlands and settled here. And the dominant culture, the cultural form that we see in the cost, sort of pulled you forward with it as well. Now, I like baseball, and those of you who like baseball probably know what that bottom means. It's a double play. It's Van Boskirk to Wessels to Blom. These are interesting characters. As we begin to study and understand our early furniture in New York, there really is only one other form that we can sort of pull ourselves back to the Netherlands on. And these are these early Stolendreher's chairs that are described here. These are Turner's chairs. And the example, there probably are 10 or 12 of these around, the New York examples. And they range in date anywhere from the 1660 period to about 1710 or so, that small group. And so we're not 100% certain, but you can see how the close parallel. And the reason the double play happened was these are names that are culled from the iconography about early Turners and Strolendrehers in New York City. But if we extend out and we get interested and excited about these objects, we can begin to see in them a continuity between these chairs and some of the chairs that are being made in the 18th century in New York that are of simple design, the turning patterns. And lo and behold, names like Blom, or Bloom, and Van Buskirk remain in the lexicon of New York cabinet makers and chair makers right up into the 19th century. So these joiner traditions, these cabinet making traditions and chair making traditions have a start with some of these folks. And a great sort of interesting thing for me is the way people adapt and change over time around them. The chair makers themselves adapted and changed. Those early low chairs that you see, something like a Cromwellian chair in England, in terms of proportions, didn't last. That design didn't last, and instead, in the 17th century, high-back cane chairs from England began to dominate. Leather chairs began to be made in Boston, and you can see how the Bloms and the Van Buskirks of the world decided, let's just put another tier on this thing, and I've got the form and the proportion of that very tall 18th century, late 17th, early 18th century cane chair or leather chair from Boston or from London. So the idea of adaptability and this idea of chairs that were for people and cheap and easy to get, and how this strain sort of lasts all through the furniture making tradition is something you've probably run into as well. It's kind of this idea of high and low. It happened then. It's very exciting to sort of embrace that sort of thing. So one of the things in my career that I suppose is a gap that I really should have worked a little bit more on was the 18th century in New York, dealing with Queen Anne, Chippendale furniture, sort of leading up to the Revolution. One of the reasons I think perhaps that's the case is that a lot of that furniture has been denigrated over the years, and maybe I lost interest in it as not being of the quality or interest of Boston or Philadelphia or Newport furniture. But one of the points I wanted to make today, I don't know if anybody in this room is ever inclined to want to be interested in it, but certainly there's lots of room for study of 18th century New York furniture, and there's lots of it around as well. Some people have been working on it, but it is a ripe area and a place that you might want to go. But there's a natural progression here as we move from the Dutch tradition into the 19th century to take me to my sort of next area, which I worked in, which I have to admit, suddenly the lights went on and it was a lot easier. There are names, there are records, there are labels on furniture, and it gets really exciting because then you can do this idea of centripetal study where you actually look at an object and you spin out from it from provenance, patronage, techniques that are used, style, all of it leads us in directions to understand it better. I have a portrait up here of Washington Irving, and I think for me he's kind of a transitional figure in my mind as well, who I stay in touch with in my mind as I look in the 19th century for connections to the past. This painting of 1809 kind of moves us forward in time to the next area of interest on my part. And here is his home, and it's not surprising that it's designed with a stepped gable up in Tarrytown, New York. And of course, his famous sketches were published in 1820 in New York, which went into Diedrich Knickerbocker, went into Rip Van Winkle, and the other figures from history of New York that he was so fascinated by. The streets that he walked on in New York looked a lot like this in 1820. This was a sophisticated man. Life in New York was really pretty great then. You had the Hudson River School unfolding. You had the National Academy of Design coming into play, certainly. You had patronage. You had lots of patrons flowing into New York after the War of 1812. And it's a very compelling moment in time. It's a time when New York is busy and growing in terms of population. By 1820, I think the population is almost 120,000 people, which is, a significant thing. Manhattan is a center of production for furniture and other things, and silver at this time. But you can see that it's getting crowded. It becomes a vertical city ultimately, with vertical integration in cabinet making and silversmithing and metal work or whatever it might be, because there's just not enough real estate to do anything but that. But certainly, I think the beauty of it in 1820 is it crystallized in this painting, and I think it's one of my favorite moments. And at this time, a couple of my favorite people sort of show up into the world. And why I really like them is one's really famous and the other marked his work. One of them is Duncan Phyfe, and the other man is Charles-Honoré Lanoyer. These two cabinet makers, I worked long and hard on them with colleagues and other researchers, and I think one of the tests in my mind always was, oh, these are the top of the market. These are the best makers in New York. Are we going to find other people just as good? And the truth is, after really going up and down on these two makers, I don't think we have. I think like New York is a place where you find Lanoyer and Phyfe in that period up to about 1820. You find in Boston the Seymours and Vaux. You find in Philadelphia Joseph Barry and other makers down there. Every city has its dominant figures, and I think we've sort of figured out in New York that it's Lanoyer and Phyfe. And sort of traveling in your mind, I think one of the things you want to think about as you go back in time is how do you get famous in New York? You know, there's made in New York, and how do you get famous in New York? I'll use a baseball analogy again. A lot of people say if they come to play for the Yankees and they're a great player, a lot of them don't work out too well because New York's a very special place to play. Well, New York's a very special place to play if you're a musician, if you are a designer, if you are in media. It always has been a very competitive place. And if you don't do your job well, you're not going to stay on top of the pile. And if you don't prepare well and you don't figure out the economics of the situation, you're not going to do so well. So New York is New York, and it really is extraordinary in terms of the vitality of the place. So the Dutch, the French, the Scots who are here, the English. I haven't found my Irish cabinet maker yet, but I'm hoping to. Appealing to me in all this, of course, with Duncan Phyfe in particular, is this tradition of him being this incredible craftsman. So we have to test out the idea. Is this man who has years and years of experience in New York, over 40 years of working in the cabinet making trade, is he really making his own furniture? And these are the important questions I think that we want to answer. What is the makeup of the shops that Lanoyer and Phyfe run? And I think we've kind of run into some interesting things that begin to shape our thinking on how these shops operated. One of the areas, again, I like to highlight this for people is I think that ultimately, once we have craftspeople and tradespeople and business people in all of this, the next question for us as scholars certainly is, how do we sort of really encapsulate this in a narrative? And I think the one thing I sort of would hope will happen at some point, I probably won't do it myself, would be to be sort of a socioeconomic or a cultural history of the cabinet maker in an urban setting like this. It hasn't been done in Boston, it hasn't been done in Philadelphia, it hasn't been done in New York. What was it like to be an urban cabinet maker from top to bottom? How did you earn a living? How did you sort of get through the business cycles? We worked on this on these individual makers, but it'd be nice to test some of the ideas out as well. Ned Cook from the Yale program has done a wonderful job on the socioeconomic sort of life of the country cabinet maker. And so we understand that a little bit better, I think, than the urban makers. Duncan Phyfe and other makers, as we move into the 19th century, from the 18th century, also are carrying with them a tradition. And so was Honoré Lanoyer. And some people say, well, that's the end of the tradition, that the trained cabinet maker who really knew what they were doing begins to erode, that you have factories and shops that are manufactories and shops that are being run by cabinet makers where apprentices are not trained fully in the 19th century. Instead, they specialize. So you take a young man and you don't exploit all his potential talents, but instead you exploit his skills in one fine area like veneering or whatever it might be to make a great product, but the whole package isn't there anymore. And with it, sometimes the vision for how a beautiful object, a design object comes together can escape people. And so your hero designer rises above. And I think Phyfe and Lanoyer play that role too, as well. Competition is very fierce in a city of 120,000. There are 300 cabinet makers by 1819 working in New York. They go up and down according to business cycles. But here are a few labels that tell you what's going on. These labels in particular are fascinating to me as part of the study of this furniture because on them there are little messages that we want to pay attention to. Here you have Phyfe in the middle, and it's dated August 1820. there's a date on that label. Here we have M. Allison or Michael Allison and the date May 1817. And over here we have Moses and Stephen Youngs also working on Broad Street in a cabinet furniture warehouse. They all have warehouses. If you notice, they're all called warehouses now. So cabinet warehousing comes into play. You also see on Charles Christian's Southern and West India cabinet furniture, which means that New York increasingly is interested in exporting furniture. So I have a cabinet warehouse. These labels tell us if I got a cabinet warehouse, I have to have wares. It's not BJ's warehouse. It's not where you go shopping. You have to have things to show. You have to have things to sell. You want to inspire people at what's in the shop. Some are better at it than others. I think Lanier and Fife in particular were good at it. Warehousing in cabinets, cabinet warehousing also meant that you had to have stocks of furniture available. So it means you have to pay somebody to make it, you have to buy the materials, you have to be economically sound to be able to do something like this. And so the idea of having a cabinet warehouse meant, I'm in this pretty big time, and I'm going to make furniture. When I get in trouble, you'll see partnerships like Moses and Stephen Youngs to lay off some of the risk that's involved with their business. The partners come and go. In essence, once a new design comes into play in New York and it's a winner by Fife or Lanier in particular, it's stolen. I worked in the shop, I made a template one night, I took it home with me, and guess what? Here's another piece of furniture by this guy that looks a lot like the other guy, and we have to start thinking about separating that if we want to separate it. So what that tells us, in essence, the whole city becomes the workshop for the cabinet makers, because if they can't keep everybody employed, they will go to other people to get what they need. So New York develops a regional or a local style that in its own way feeds itself. And so when you see advertisements abroad, meaning in the South or somewhere else, it would be New York furniture, the latest New York furniture, and you'd want to know what it was. Now we look at our labels and we think about those dates. When you go to the store to buy milk, you're not going to buy old milk, right? You're going to look at the date on it. Well, the date's on the label, which tells you this is the latest fashion. If I'm buying it in 1818, well, I can live with that. But if you get it in 1826 and it says 1817, you say, maybe I better go to New York and see what's in style. So the labels are fascinating, and there aren't enough of them around. But one of the beauties about Lanier is he marked his work, which is terrific, a lot of his work. Fife did not, which is also very interesting. The business aspect. There were chair makers in New York who advertised they could produce 400 chairs on short notice for a ship's captain who might want to take them somewhere. In the course of research, I discovered that some of this furniture was being taken to Rio de Janeiro and to Brazil, to Argentina, to other places. So, I said New York is a great place to work, but also you can write a grant to go down there to study it as well. I took trips to Cuba and found New York furniture scattered throughout Cuba. This was a business, and they were trying to sort of really make it work. But the making, as you can see, is fascinating. You have, in the bottom, you have William Boutre. His real name is William Butter from Scotland, but it paid to be French once Lanier was here. And you have William Boutre in the center, obviously dressed well. This isn't really the shop, but it's an imaginary view of the kind of activities that go on. You have a man turning, you have a man assembling, you have a man over here caning or rushing the seat. Here you have varnishing, somebody grinding the paint and the varnish. Oh, and lo and behold, there's an artist in a high collar and Regency jacket. He's a fancy Dan. He's probably more valuable than anybody else. So he gets to buy a nice coat, a nice suit of coat, but everybody else is a workman. But these are the kinds of places that we see, and they're not that big, but they really were efficient, and they would have perhaps turners working there. We do know from our records that some of the turning was done in New Jersey and shipped in by the creeks into New York Harbor, the parts taken into New York City. You get a chair, a fancy chair, a set of them sometime, you'll see different parts on them because they got lazy or they grabbed them in the bin and they put it together and you have different turning on it. But close looking like that, is extremely important, as I mentioned before. But ultimately, the goal for a guy like Fife and Lanier was to catch the carriage trade. And when Lanier and Fife began to look for customers, neither of them were really going for the volume at all. They sold expensive furniture. They flattered their customers. Fife, in particular, was well known for his cabinet warehouse and workshops that were on Fulton Street. The shops stood exactly where the World Trade Center used to stand, and his house was across the street, and he paid a lot of attention to the house. This dates to about 1816 or so, and shows his first residence on your right that he built up over there on Fulton Street when it was called Partition Street. And then in 1815 or 16, he added these two buildings as well. And if you analyze the picture a little bit, you begin to see what's going on. In the center, maybe Fife, maybe his shop person, is showing two ladies in their Grecian dresses a pair of Quizmos chairs that they might enjoy having. You see some boys over on the far left. My assumption is that something's going on over on that side. It may have something to do with the manufacturing of the furniture, and we know that from the bulkheads that are out on the street. You see, they're passing the lumber through the bulkheads, putting it in the basement or taking it to the back. You come in the front door, there's a set of stairs that go up, and I like to think about what we just looked at a moment ago, where this is upstairs as well at Morgan and Sanders. Later on, there are fire insurance maps that show openings in the Fife shop, so you could move from one side to the other. These are not 1850s after the business is over, but it wouldn't surprise me as he developed this site that he began to sort of think about that aspect of it as well. In his lifetime, Fife works at Partition Street, first works at Broad Street beginning in 1792, and then he moves to Partition Street by 1794, and he works there until 1847. That's a very long career. And all around him, New York is growing up all along. And he's keeping up with style. Style is important to him. But at some point, he runs out of gas, and he's a control freak, I think, and he's not going to turn this business over to his sons and have them decide they're going to do something really that he doesn't like. So by 1847, he folds up and he decides to stop. There's a famous comment about a Southerner, a man named Hammond, who came to New York in 1839 or 38, and he wrote back to his wife about buying furniture here, and he's bragging about getting this sofa here and that thing there. And I went to Fife's, but he's too expensive. He still thinks it's 1836. This is before the crash, and he's out of style, he said. He's out of style. Maybe he's just telling his wife that because he didn't want to pay for it, but it happens. So New York begins to develop vertically, as I mentioned to you before, as we study our cabinet makers and the furniture making trade. And you can see here the workshop of Joseph Meeks and Sons that they occupied from 1828 to 1834 on Broad Street. Later they moved to Vesey Street. They combined two buildings just like Fife and made it a little fancier. But as you can see, now we've moved up to 4 stories tall, and we begin to see buildings that are functioning probably most of the time with apprentice boys and sleeping in the top gable part of the building, and down below you would have the start of a piece of furniture, and as it would be completed, it would be passed down the line to the final level where it might be upholstered, and then brought to the ground floor where it would be sold in the showroom. So this vertical way of doing it is fascinating. I also like the Broad Street view where you have the early Dutch building still in the corner. And way at the top of Broad Street in 1834, you haven't built the Great Customs House. So this is pre-1834 view, the A.J. Davis Customs House. And ultimately, you wind up by the 1850 period, even the late 40s, with significant furniture factories, like this place that is the establishment of Charles Baudouin, which is on the corner and runs all the way down the block practically, one more story tall, over 200 employees in there, and a chair on your right is an example they made for the White House in 1845. So maybe Francois Macron sat on that yesterday. We're not sure. Now, I talk about some of the influences on me. Style is evidence. Who's ever heard of that? No. Beth Weiss is here. This is an article by Jules Prown in the Winterthur Portfolio, which he talks about style and objects that have style. There's a message in style for all of us. There's a message in design and style, it's kind of, what's going on here. But there's a message in all of this for us. And in the case of Lanier and Fife, they each are doing something with style that really transforms New York City in certain ways. And the objects that have that style can be analyzed and read in terms of style. Oftentimes, as art historians, as curators, we have trouble with objects that carry two styles in them at one time. We like it pure. It's just like me wanting those earliest Dutch things, but it's not always that way at all. It kind of comes together in different ways. They transition, and they're all interesting. But the idea of establishing style is the role of Lanier and Fife in New York, particularly Lanier, who we'll look at first. I have here a portrait of, that I'll show you now, of Jacques Milbert. I have one thing I want to read. Jacques Milbert wrote a book, and you see it on the other side. They're published in 1826. He was in New York in 1815, we know. Went back and traveled all throughout the Northeast into Canada, went back to France, and then wrote his book. But he was in New York around 1815, 1816, and here's what he has to say about furniture in New York. And think about this in terms of style. Milbert writes, "Furnishings for the home, they're either manufactured by the Americans or imported from France or England. Beds, tables, chairs, chests of drawers, secretary, etc. are made here, and they are superior in construction and solidity, if not in taste and shape. Elegant but fragile pieces of French furniture are occasionally ordered for use as models, but they are veneered on an inferior quality of wood, poorly made and glued, and intended merely to please the eye. It is easy to see how, in a damp climate, subject to extreme variations in temperature, they cannot stand competition with the perfectly fitted American products of heavy mahogany." How do I translate that? A Scotsman made it. An Englishman made it here. A Dutchman made it here. A Frenchman wouldn't make it like that. But that's not true. When I went to France and I showed Lanier furniture pictures to the curators over there, particularly at the Malmaison, Bernard Rondeau said to me, he said, "Oh, what is this, German?" I said, "No, it's American." So maybe it was heavier than usual. So, however, this is what Milbert says: "To pay homage to our country its due homage, I shall add that French workmen started this business in America, and it is they who are developing it most successfully. They use the best models in books on furniture and interior decoration by Messieurs Percier and Fontaine." Now, who is he referring to if he's in New York in 1815? We know who he's referring to. He's referring to Lanier and a circle of French cabinet makers that work in his shop. And they are making progress. They are really making change. Lanier is an interesting character. It's really nice to work with a person on a biography. Ulrich Laban did great work in Paris for the Lanier book. He discovered where this man was born and went to his home at Chantilly. His father ran an inn there called Le Grand Cerf. He was a caterer and a hotel or an innkeeper. But of course, the revolution came and things were hard. He sent one of his sons to Paris to be a cabinet maker, and he learned his trade from his wife's uncle, Jean-Baptiste Cauchois. So Nicolas Lanier, the oldest brother, goes and learns the trade in Paris, and here's his trade card in the English style, very much in the English style, and he kept his shop in Paris. While in Paris, during the sort of at the height of the revolution, Honoré Lanier and his whole family lost their home essentially in Chantilly, and they came to Paris and they lived with this man, Nicolas Lanier, and he set them up. He also set up young Honoré Lanier in his shop to work for him a little earlier than that, actually in 1791. So we know that Lanier, before the revolution, was exposed to very high-end society. If Nicolas' shop was on the Rue Palais de Louvre, the Rue Saint Thomas de Louvre, right across from the Palais Royal, This is where a lot of shopping went on. He saw also how his brother worked, what he sold. He learned the business from him. Did he learn cabinet making or did he learn the business of cabinet making? It's a very good question. This is the stamp that is on Nicola's commode. And one of the intriguing things about it is, I don't know if you can see, I don't have a pointer on here, I don't think, Ethan, but you can see his name, N. Lanier, but upside down here, you see F, and then if you look carefully, upside down it says F-B-U-R-Y, Ferdinand Bury, who is a German maker who works in the Faubourg Saint-Germain. And you also see JME on an angle over the N overstruck it on the other end, and it has Giron, Menuisier, and Eboniste. That is the guild stamp. So a piece of furniture like this has got some messages for us, and the messages are, Nicolas Lanier had it made in the Faubourg Saint-Germain. He had it taken to his shop at the Rue Saint-Thomas-du-Louvre, maybe put some ornaments on it, and then sold it as his work, which is really what this business is all about. He ran a manufactory. So sometimes we have a glorious idea of these cabinet makers doing it all by hand, but really what it's about is taste and finding the best craftsman to do the work for you and being very demanding. And I think he learned that at his brother's heel. He comes to New York in 1803. He advertised his cabinet maker from Paris, of course, and in his first ad he says he has with him models and patterns and handsome, safe locks and borders of ornaments and things of that nature. And he's bringing something new to town here that's never been seen before in 1803. And this is an example by Lanier that's put on a plate from La Messengère, which is a fashion journal that is published beginning in 1801 till the 1830s that is sent out. These little fashion messages are sent to Lanier or anybody else who wants them on a serial basis, so we can show you changes in style over time. But you can see how closely it is aligned to some 1802 designs when he comes in 1803, the commodes, the pier tables. And Lanier himself, in his shop, essentially changes the language of design in New York, which I find fascinating from a design perspective. That he's a real lion about this thing, and he bends the will of other cabinet makers to begin to make what he is making to keep up with him. He doesn't ask them to do it, but he has to stay ahead of them all the time as well. So as we know from Milbert, he is using Percier and Fontaine. We know that he has brought patterns with him, which are probably La Messengère, and you can see how he's working right out of Percier and Fontaine. This is the great bed, French bed made for the Van Rensselaer family. You can see the closeness of the design of the scrolled end, fulcrum-like end on it, and how it relates to the Percier and Fontaine plate. By the end of the War of 1812, Lanier is just really, he's cruising along here. There's some tough times in 1808 with the embargo and so forth, but New York really exploded after the War of 1812. There was lots of money here, lots of pent-up money. There was the English began to dump a lot of mercantile products here. Southerners were flocking to New York. Others were coming to New York to get these goods. So there was a clientele, and Lanier was well positioned. His cousin came with him to New York. We know this J.B. Cauchois, that is his maternal uncle who trained Nicolas. J.B. is dead. Jean-Charles, we know, was here and leaves by 1808. So this bed by Lanier is made before 1808. And he establishes another new form, it's what's called the French bedstead. And just to keep things relevant, it's very important to realize that his design sources are not restricted to France. I guess he must have known Donald. The guéridon, or the center table, is something that is ubiquitous in early Victorian homes. You see it in the late classical period, but Lanier is sort of the first on the scene with it. The pier table, the square pier table, as it's called, sort of rather prosaically in the cabinet maker's price books, is something that he brings with him as well. And eventually it unfolds into these richly, richly decorated examples. And in Lanier's work, they're very novel. You know, novelty is not a bad thing. Sometimes people think it's frippery. But he does veneered columns. These are cast lead figures. He does columns wrapped in tin. He does carved caryatids. He really works these tables. And what he is doing with them essentially is saying, okay, Mrs. Pierpont, you're going to buy your chairs from Duncan Fife maybe, But you're going to have a wall that you would think you're in Paris. There'll be a beautiful glass pier mirror. There will be my pier table, and the curtains will be done in the style of French design books, so that you have this really, come see my parlor, and I have something different than everybody else. And that's a very important thing when you're working with wealthy clientele. Things that look like this, of course, go on into the 1820s and 30s. French Bureau, as it's called, but it is a commode antique in France. I think in the Journal des Dames, there is mention in the late 1790s about ladies bruising their elbows on the heavy four-square furniture in the late antique style, or a woman used to be able to move a chair in a room, but now it takes two men to move one of these antique chairs for her. There's a monumentality to it and a strength and a view of this, the idea of lasting quality that's very important. Here is Lanier's French sideboard, as it was called in the period, and in France it's called a dessert, and it's really the same form without as many ornaments, slightly anglicized. And once Lanier sets the taste, of course, others are in the game, like Elam Williams here in an 1814 ad, and even Duncan Fife sort of got into the game. This example with an opening in the center for a cellarette. Lanier's great achievement, however, are these gilded caryatid tables, which are extremely beautiful and exciting. The workmanship is extraordinary. The carving is terrific. It sets up a question, of course, when you study this carving that's been asked, and it sort of comes to mind, is where does he get a carver like this in New York City? Is he bringing a brilliant carver from Paris to New York? Is he bringing the figures from Paris to New York? It's a tough question to answer. Thomas Hope, in his household furniture and interior decoration, writes about his house and how difficult it was to find anybody in all of London in 1802 to carve the furniture that he had a vision for. He finally found somebody from Belgium, I think, or the Low Countries, he described them, to do the work for him. So if that's that hard in London, where is it happening right here in New York? I think it's extraordinary that if Lanier is bringing these craftsmen to work in his shop, there's enough work for them to be here. It's something that's worth studying still. The figures that we know so far are made either of mahogany or of basswood, not a wood necessarily associated with American manufacture. Lanier is a real threat. He's a real threat to Fife. Fife has that beautiful shop he set up, but he has tremendous competition in this man, and he's trying to keep up with him. And Lanier, sadly, dies in 1819 at the age of 40. This man, John Gruis, advertises that he, at one point, that he was superintended the interior of Monsieur Lanier's manufactory. So these are important people to know about, the superintendents, as we study and dig into this subject matter. The superintendents are the foremen. They are the ones who get the people with the great skills all orchestrated to work on the same page. So the upper cabinet frame, the table frame is being made over here. The person putting the veneers on is over there. The carver and the gilder's over here. Somebody's recutting. Somebody's got to check. How do these things fit? Let's make all this work. And Gruis is your guy. Unfortunately, he's very difficult to find anything about, except that he's also from Paris. Lanier never becomes an American citizen either, which I think is fascinating. Was he unable to do it because he was so busy, or did he choose not to? We also know that he operated in the French language. He wrote in the French language, so it was not necessarily something he wanted to do. Fife, on the other hand, is an interesting figure as well. He comes from nowhere, basically, which we all love a story like this, or somewhere that we don't know about. For all of our study of him, we're really not sure where his training occurred. He's not easy to follow like Lanier. We do know he's Scottish. Here's his snuff box with the thistle on it, as you can see. And this is where he was born, in Scotland. He was baptized, in this parish church, which is near Loch Fonnach. You all have heard of the Loch Ness Monster. That's a neighboring lake. It's in the Highlands of Scotland. It's a very beautiful mountain setting. But as a young man, he's born in 1770. He's brought to New York. By family tradition, it's said that he went to Albany with the family in the 1780s. But there's no sign of any Fifes in Albany until the census of 1790, when His mother, widowed mother, is living there with two boys, underage boys, who must be Fife's younger brothers. In 1793, she dies. He's the executive of her estate. Did his training occur in Albany? I mean, this is a retrospective view of what Albany looked like in 1805. It was not a buzzing town for cabinet making. Our suspicion is that, more likely than not, he came to New York to work. He comes to New York, works in the 1790s, and we track his career. He really doesn't hit the big time until he actually gets this commission from William Bayard that we know about in 1807. William Bayard's portrait here by Gilbert Stuart, and here's one of the beautiful chairs that was made from one of two sets of chairs that you just saw in the bill of sale. There are some bills of sale for Duncan Fife that allow us to track the furniture and to date it. We, through diligent research by Francis Breder, who's here today, and my team that worked on the Duncan Fife show, we're really able to connect some pieces of furniture and authentically document them to their work. And that's something I view as very important to the kind of work and study that you do, not to be too generous with attributions and let them find their way back to the fold when you can and open your eyes to the possibilities. But let's give you what we have right now. Fife manages somehow, in his own way, to create beautiful furniture in a much more English Regency design. Here we see drawings by Fife. We saw the chair he just did a moment ago. And these are two drawings of a curule chair and a Clismo side chair. And you can see the direct precedent in the London Chairmakers and Carvers, supplement to the London Chairmakers and Carvers Book of Prices of 1808. There's an 1807 edition that shows scrollback chairs, but my goodness, this is early that he's sort of getting into this. Is his patron bringing ideas to him? Are there craftsmen coming into his shop that are trained in London and other places or are knowledgeable about this design? Does he have his hand on the London cabinet maker and Carver's Book of Prices in his shop as well to inform him of style? He is the king, he becomes the king of this tripod table form, saber-leg Grecian furniture. It's something new and beautiful, and this is something that he does exquisitely, and he has a beautiful run of this from a period of about 1805 to 1820 or so, when this style of furniture was a good parallel to Lanier's work, and Fife was playing around with Lanier's sort of work, but this was his meat and potatoes as well. By 1820, things begin to change. In 1819, there is a panic, the first financial panic, sort of the first small major recession in this country that struck, and cabinet makers were losing their jobs because there wasn't enough clientele coming around, and Fife began to ship some furniture abroad. So the dated furniture, some of this material has been found in the South. We know he had connections in Savannah and some in Charleston as well, but particularly in Savannah in the period of around 1820 or so. He also began to manufacture these tables in his shop with the rounded corners, which are quite extraordinary. And again, talking about digging in on an object, the joy of sort of turning it over and understanding, well, that's an old piece, but what's really great is that when you begin to study it, you see the entire corner is made out of essentially plywood, a sandwich that you can bend, and the reason you can bend it is of all these curves that are cut into it. You can put it on a form, and guess what? You can then take all the forms with the corners, put them on a shelf, and say, I'll have a rosewood one, I'll have a mahogany one, I'll have a rosewood one, I'll have a mahogany one, and you begin to see the process of being able to more rapidly put these tables together. He's establishing a style, making superior quality manufactured goods, and he may be doing this expediency in order to cut down on the cost of making the tables so that every one is not hand manufactured, and this is a way for him to beat it as well. The period of about 1820 to into the 20s, Lanier dies, and somebody has to take over for this furniture that, as Milbert said, the French workmen started this in this country. But now it's a blending. It's a real blending of, I think, a strong sort of George Smith, Thomas Hope meets France. And you wind up with designs of this sort that come out of the Fife shop. This particular table in the Museum of the City of New York is extraordinary, made about 1827, we think. And it has on its top a painted scagliola design. but there's a richness to it that is the kind of other side of the coin for Fife of Lanoyer's work. And the quality is superior, but you wouldn't mistake that for a piece of Lanoyer furniture by a long shot. But you might mistake that one, and they were mistaken for many years as possibly from the Lanoyer shop, but again, of superior quality. And the field was open for Fife to sort of make his move into this empire furniture designs that Lanoyer starts, but then is picked up very seriously by English designers as well, even in the earlier 1800s. And Lanoyer is gone, so Fife fulfills the need. This is a piece from about 1822, documented from his shop. This is a piece from about 1826, documented from the Fife shop. And here's an example that's signed on the upholstery by Fife that's at the Brooklyn Museum, an extraordinary window seat that there was a pair of these made for Robert Donaldson of Fayetteville, North Carolina, who then becomes a New Yorker and then moves up the Hudson ultimately, and this suite of furniture is still preserved largely between the Brooklyn Museum and Classical American Homes Preservation Trust. The scagliola top that we see here is of extraordinary quality. The freehand gilded decoration that runs around the perimeter, you want to talk about planning and design. How is it that that is so perfectly planned? I mean, I can't hang wallpaper straight, but to lay on this design and plan it out so beautifully, there's time that went into this particular table. And in the center, you see a Roman centurion sort of diving into the fire in a chasm that opened in the Forum. And the challenge, they prayed to the gods, how do you get this to close up again? And they said, throw your treasure in, throw your treasure in. And they threw their jewels in, and they threw their money in. And finally, this brave soldier ran up to it, jumped in on his horse, and you realize the greatest treasure in Rome was its citizen soldier. So it closed over in the floor of the Forum. Actually, when you go to the Forum, there's still apparently an acknowledgement of this. From the fire and the flames of the Forum to the fire and flames of New York in 1835, the Great Fire of New York, which actually, I'm thinking, probably decimated that first Meek shop over on Broad Street. It burned many blocks of lower Manhattan. But the fire purges that gilded style in certain ways. It purifies the air for us so we can look at what's going to happen next. We go from incredible gilded furniture. There is a transition here, but I'm not going to take you through it, to some extraordinary design that happens in the Fife shop. This is where style is evidence. What is the evidence? The evidence is this man has his finger on the pulse of style. This man has to stay ahead of the curve stylistically. He has to keep pleasing his clients. And so beginning around I think the first evidence we have of it in sort of documentation is 1834. Fife turns towards a new French design again, sort of the Restauration style, very simplified design. His Grecian scroll, as he called that support on the pier table that you see, turns up everywhere, whether it's on the arms of sofas, it turns up on all sorts of forms. It's been coined by Thomas Gordon Smith and called the Grecian plain style, the present plain style. It's simple. So as this furniture emerges, it's also fascinating that New York is becoming, in many ways, the center for architecture for the South, for the Midwest. Of course, Latrobe is in Philadelphia. He's making great strides. He's one of the early Greek Revival architects. But the key people are here in New York. They're the ones, including A.J. Davis and others who begin in 1834-5 to establish the American Institute of Architects. They are going to be the coming generation of people who build these beautiful interiors. And what looks better in a Greek Revival interior, which is of monumental scale, delicate ornament, and a lot of clarity in the ornament, these objects really stand out. These are the homes that this belongs in the best. I would bet anything if you took some of this beautiful furniture and put it in a high-ceiling loft that you painted white, it would astound you how beautiful it is. The wood is extraordinary in it in particular. You can see Fife is now leaning on La Messangère, and La Messangère, you can keep tracking in the dates when all of this is made. This is a chair we think is made about 1837 for the Foote family. This is a piece of furniture that we confidently attributed to the Fife shop based on details that relate to other documented pieces of furniture. But look at the wood. Fife actually, I'm sorry it's a little dark here, almost paints with veneer. He has different cuts, different size crotches, different size elements that fit the size of the piece, of the component part of the furniture. One of the things about Fife is that we can't forget he's a successful businessman. That's what allows him to do this. He, in his lifetime, owned over 15 pieces of Manhattan property. In 1852, one ground rent of one of his properties was over $4,000 a year. So talk about flattening out the business cycles, not worrying. I've got cash. Well, the mahogany guys are going to bring him the best logs. In fact, by tradition, according to the family, they were called Fife logs because he put his mark on everything good. So it'd be like going to dinner with somebody and sharing a steak, and they took the fillet off on you every time. He was really good, and he earned it, and he had the money to sort of get where he needed to go. Here's a very beautiful design from my perspective. There's the clarity in that piece of furniture that you see in Greek Revival architecture. And look at the quality of the veneer in the top, extraordinary crotch veneers coming to us principally from Santo Domingo at this point. And it isn't long before veneering comes to the point where we actually basically decimated our resource down there and are unable to get it anymore, and woods begin to change. You see walnut and rosewood and other things being used. Here is a family example with a label in it, but I put it up to show you the precision workmanship in a piece of documented Fife furniture. And again, like those corners I mentioned to you before, when you open one of these up, there's a hard precision to the design, and in that hole there's a bolt that goes down into the strut, into the console below. It's like you could take a car wrench to change your spark plugs. Everything is consistent. It just boom, boom, boom. So you sort of see it come off the shelf, go together. You say, well, that's manufactured furniture. How can that be beautiful? Well, it is because of design. And this is what you do here. You do design. And I'm sort of encouraging people to get interested in this period of furniture because there's a lot to be learned about it, a lot. Now, I said at one point during the Fife exhibition that maybe this is not fair, but I said a piece of Fife furniture is like a bespoke suit. It's precise. It fits extraordinarily well. And then you get guys who wear bowling shirts. This is a great piece of furniture, though, at the same time. And this is where we have to wrap our minds around what's going on here. You have steam power available to Fife. You have steam power available to the Meeks shop that makes this piece of furniture, this documented piece of furniture. And you realize how adventurous the design is. And also, if you sort of tie it to the idea of where it went, that becomes more and more important because a piece of furniture like this looks extraordinary in one of those wonderful big homes. It's got muscle and it's got vitality, but it's got an idea. And Meeks has an idea that Fife never sort of landed on, which is almost like an artisan mannerism that you find working into the design. It's beautiful in its own right, but again, as I mentioned before, this furniture needs the homes that it was built for to really show off at its best. One of the nice pleasures about my new job working at Classical American Homes Preservation Trust is that the mother of the arts, the architecture, is what I'm sort of getting to enjoy now. I kind of went backwards at this a little bit, starting as a furniture curator, and as I like to say, taking care of tables and chairs is a little bit like taking care of cats and dogs. Now I'm a large animal veterinarian, paying attention to gigantic order columns. So the Meeks broadside that we see here is, I think we'll end with this now, is something that I think shows what a person like Fife can do in a setting, what a furniture maker like Meeks can do, the choices that are available to designers in New York and to manufacturers in New York. Where's your market? Where do you want to be? This particular broadside, which is rare, the only one that's known, in the Metropolitan's collection was discovered in New Orleans. And then there was an outlet for Meeks furniture in New Orleans. There are a couple of labeled pieces, I think, at this New York State Museum that say they were selling it down in New Orleans as well. As the times changed and Fife changed and he eventually retired in 1847, somebody had to keep making furniture. Like IKEA says, it's a big country. Somebody's got to make furniture for it. But it doesn't mean that all this manufactured furniture isn't important. It is very important, and it's more important when we begin to understand, as we spin out from it, the provenance of objects, where it was, how it was used, who owned it, what were the choices that were being made. All in all, it's a furniture maker's perspective, and I hope you've enjoyed it today. Thank you for letting me share it with you.
Would you be open
I-
to questions?
I'm more than happy.
I just wanted to make a
Ethan-
quick
Ethan,
announcement. So yeah, we can have a bit of a discussion now. Just wanted to make everyone aware that after this, there will be a reception in the Great Hall with cocktails and hors d'oeuvres, and you are all urged to go up there. Also, for those of you not from the Cooper Hewitt, we have tickets you can collect now. We'll give you free admission to the museum whenever you want to use it. So be sure to pick one up on your way out of the room. But for now, if anyone does have a question, wants to bring something up with Peter Kenny, I think we have microphones going around.
Sure, happy to answer questions, or Carly.
You know, Fife is so influential earlier in his career, and it seems like everybody's copying Fife, or
Yeah.
trying to copy Fife. But in that Grecian plain style, you see this incredible, I mean, I think, you know, as good a period of Fife as there is, but yet it seems like people aren't copying him any longer. I mean, that Meeks table, I mean, to me, that looks like hell.
Oh, well.
You know, compared to the Fife stuff. It's interesting that Fife really is going it alone. Nobody's really copying him anymore.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
alone making the best stuff, and
Yeah.
everybody else is just falling away. It seems.
That's a very good question. I mean, as you think about why that might be, the closest thing to Fife furniture, of course, is some French furniture. You see some beautiful consoles and so forth, Charles Dice and others that are pretty extraordinary in their singularity of their single scroll and so forth. But perhaps it is the cost factor. I don't know. It could be the cost factor. It could be people are moving on. It could be people are feeling the energy of an emerging new style. I know I didn't show, but in Fife's work at the tail end, there is stuff that is overlaid with some of this old French style, it's called, leaning towards, slightly towards, some of it has strap work like you'd see on a Louis XIV piece. Is that the kind of energy that's pent up that may be showing up at Meeks's work that allows him to make the change to have that next style? We know more Meeks work. We know lots of Meeks work that sort of moves into that Italian and Gothic look. I don't know, Carly. It's an interesting question. I think there's a restlessness, perhaps, and maybe Fife is a little older in style. I don't know. Good question, though. Really good question. No answer for it, though. Anybody else? Yes, Debbie?
Have any of the pieces that were offered at auction, the things in the purple and orange plush, and the other things in the 1840s, turned up?
That's a really good question as well. I think some things probably have, but they may not have that covering on them anymore. There are some chairs, like at the Aiken-Rhett Mansion in South Carolina, there are some sprung chairs that are there that very well could have had those coverings on them. There are chairs that look like the White House chair from 1845 that have more sprightly design in the sort of balloon back shape that are out there that might have had that kind of covering as well. Fascinating. This, what Debbie is referring to is that 1847 catalog, which I would have loved to put in as a appendix in the book, because it wouldn't have been that hard to do essentially a facsimile of it. It was lost in the library at Winterthur forever. It literally could not be found, and I was in a panic that it wasn't found. Finally, they did find it, but it was found after the show was up. But if you ever have a chance to read through it, it's a fascinating thing. It has, as Debbie mentioned, lots of unusual colors to the furniture, upholstery. Some of the descriptions in there are quite extraordinary. There are refrigerators in there. mahogany refrigerators, but that shouldn't be surprising. But yeah, I think Fife, if he's making that furniture, I don't think it's going to quite look like Baudouin. I don't think it's going to quite look like Ranguet-Laprince and a few other people who are working. Maybe if he had turned his sons loose like Meeks did, they would move to the next phase of things. He also, here's the other thing that I didn't mention, is by 1843, he has advertised that he's going out of business, essentially. And it's not until 1847 that he sells things. So he may be not as actively making furniture either, but yeah, we have to find the bill of sale and the house and the things that look like that to help us to really come through on it. And that's a very important thing, I think, is finding the documentation that goes with it. Yeah. Other questions? No? Okay, great.
Thank you so much, Peter.
You're welcome.
Hello, welcome back to the heart of the operation today. So, Made in New York, the 27th Annual Parsons Cooper Hewitt Graduate Symposium in the History of Design. Of course, last night we had Peter Kenny here talking about furniture makers in New York, and today we will have a variety of graduate student papers presenting on a whole range of aspects from the 17th century Dutch New Yorkers up to the present day, touching on fashion and jewelry and fortune telling and all sorts of really wonderful things. Unfortunately, there has been a bit of a change of plans in the scheduling. So one of our speakers can't make it because of a family emergency. As a result, the morning session will be the three papers. We'll have Cynthia Koch, Benjamin Green, and then Sarah Mallory. And then we'll break for lunch, and in the afternoon have Anna Rasha and Jeffrey McCullough. So just be aware of the slight change in timing. With that, then, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Cynthia Koch is a second-year PhD student at Yale University. Her research focuses on global material culture, particularly trade and craftsmanship under European colonial governance, as well as imitative material practices inspired by transnational encounters. She received her BA in History and Political Economy from the University of California, Berkeley, and her MA in Decorative Arts, Design, History, and Material Culture from the Bard Graduate Center across the park. Cynthia has held graduate intern positions at the Frick Collection, the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan, and is currently a research assistant at the Yale Center for British Art. So her paper this morning starts us off in the 17th century city, a node in the Netherlands' worldwide network of trade. It's entitled Japanse Rokken, Bizarre Silks and Portraiture, the Making of Dutch-American Merchant Identity in 17th Century New York. Please welcome Cynthia Koch. Sorry, this was supposed to be much more fluid.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and I wanted to say thanks to Professor Roby and the selection committee for inviting me to give this paper, and I'd just like to preface it by saying that I'm thinking of it as an excerpt as part of a larger project and definitely something I'd like to return to, so I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I welcome any questions or comments. Okay. Okay, sure. Can you hear me better? Yeah, okay. An early 18th century portrait depicts Isaac de Peyster, the son of a wealthy Dutch-American merchant family in New York. In such portraits, sitters are often shown with signs of their wealth and status, a luxurious estate or expensive material objects such as porcelain or Turkish carpets. Instead, Isaac is surrounded by an impenetrably dark background. This portrait is cropped closely to focus on his face and upper body. All markers of material wealth are concentrated in his dress. Isaac wears a white kerchief trimmed in fine lace and a robe patterned with rock and spindly vegetation within a broken oval. The artist captures the soft, luminous sheen of the gold silk and even shows a flash of the red lining with the upturned sleeve. The fabric would likely have been a drawloom woven brocaded silk, its intricate patterning making it much more expensive than a plain silk. Although the style of Isaac's portrait is distinct to Hudson Valley patroon painters, neither the costly textile itself nor the fashion for silk robes originated in the Americas. In his choice of dress, Isaac not only displays his family's wealth, but also articulates their connection to a Dutch global trading empire centered in the Netherlands. The Dutch world of the 17th and 18th centuries was one that coalesced around maritime enterprises and international ports rather than permanent colonization. Merchants and sailors who traveled to New Amsterdam kept close ties to the Netherlands through their personal relationships. Families repeatedly traversed the Atlantic in search of profitable ventures or in accordance with West India Company assignments. Even after the Dutch ceded New York to the British in 1644, Dutch merchants in the Americas continued to assert an identity with a strong European Dutch heritage. This self-fashioning is evident in patroon portraits like that of Isaac de Peyster, in which the subject often adopts the latest Dutch styles. Although the garment Isaac wears in the portrait is no longer extant, it is likely a robe fashioned after Japonzoroken, a type of loose-fitting kimono that came into vogue in the mid-17th century when the Dutch East India Company had exclusive access to trade with Japan. The pattern on Isaac's robe, now known as bizarre silk patterns, similarly came into production in Europe because of increased access to Japanese designs. In the Americas, the merchants who wore bizarre silks or Japonzoroken not only emphasized their newly acquired wealth, but also asserted their relationship to the trading capital of Amsterdam and their identity as distinctly Dutch American rather than British American or simply American. So part 1, Japanese robes. In the first half of the 17th century, the Dutch Regency was influenced by Spanish dress, characterized by heavy black silks and satins with gold and silver brocaded thread and decoration. In portraiture, black clothing was meant to offset the sitter's facial features, dignifying without distracting. The set of pendant portraits of Herman Dumer and his wife Bertie Martens by Rembrandt represents the costume of Dutch burghers at this time. While the dark fabric and white ruffs could be quite costly, they appear sedate and understated. With the import of fabrics from China, Japan, and India, however, colorful patterned silks came into vogue, especially amongst an increasingly wealthy merchant class. Despite class anxieties and moralist concerns, the growing Dutch upper middle class embraced new fashions that included East Asian textiles and complex patterning. Linda Ann Stone Ferrier ties the shift from admonishing to admiring to the increased consumption and production of silks over the course of the 17th century, and especially to the influx of silks through the East India Company. Japonzoroken, such as the one pictured here, first entered the Netherlands as diplomatic gifts that the Japanese shogun gave to East India Company officials. They were typically made of silk and padded with silk wadding. They soon became highly prized in the Netherlands for their comfort and beauty, and the term Japonzorok became a generic one for this style of robe, even though later 17th century robes were not necessarily imported from Japan. This robe, for example, is made of a gold silk damask from China, with a red brocaded silk lining from Persia. The wool padding suggests that it was tailored in England or the Netherlands. Wool was rarely used in Japan, even after trade with Europe made it more accessible. That each component of the robe comes from a disparate origin speaks to the global reach of Dutch trade, as well as the demand for European tailors who could assemble this type of fashionable garment. Starting from the middle of the 17th century, there are known tailors who specialized in making Japonzoroken in Amsterdam. Peter Spies, for example, was referred to specifically as a Japonzorok maker shortly after he became a tailor in 1665, before he went on to be a cotton salesman in 1676 and later the owner of an East India shop. While few of these garments remained, records show that they were in high demand. In 1673, the death inventory of Bartel Jans Broenvis, merchant and owner of an East India store in Amsterdam, showed that he had 44 yaponzoroken made from various Asian textiles, 7 of which were meant for children. Merchants would also write letters to VOC officials specifically requesting that they deliver yaponzoroken. In 1641, Antonio van Diemen sent a letter from Batavia to Dejima, the East India Company base in Japan, requesting, quote, 48 pieces in different colors and all padded with silk, unquote. Yaponzoroken seem to have remained persistently popular and in limited supply in the Netherlands. Possessing a silk robe indicated that the owner had to be sufficiently wealthy and influential to have access to such an exclusive object. Their status as luxury items made yaponzoroken a popular choice of costume for portraits. For example, a painting titled The Mathematics Lesson by Michel van Muscher shows the tutor wearing a luminous, unpatterned red silk robe. Van Muscher skillfully depicts the plush texture and subtle shine of the robe, lined with blue silk. Scattered around the room are also a globe, an Indian or Turkish carpet, and measuring instruments, objects of worldliness and erudition. A similar 1686 portrait by Van Muscher of Johannes Hude, director of the East India Company and burgomaster of Amsterdam, as well as a respected mathematician, shows Hude similarly surrounded by signs of his status. A carpet, likely from Kashmir or Lahore, is draped on his desk, which is covered in papers referring to his position as burgomaster. Hude is likewise wearing a yaponzorok made of fine silk, notably more complex with its floral patterns than the math tutor's robe. As a merchant, Hude would have had early access to yaponzoroken and bolts of imported silk. In both paintings, yaponzoroken have become markers of erudition linked to the trade, but also to enlightenment and sophistication. Despite criticism of brightly colored silk as gauche and sinful, leaders in Amsterdam instead styled it as a sign of their experience and rightfully earned privilege. These gowns were valued for the quality of their material, as well as the warmth they provided in the cold northern winters, but they also signaled a desire on the part of the subject to be understood as worldly and knowledgeable. Part 2, Bizarre Silks. Into the late 17th century, wealthy burghers, and especially traders, transitioned to wearing patterned robes. The portrait of Stephen Wolters, for example, shows the wealthy merchant wearing a silk robe with a pattern of exotically dressed dancers interspersed with large flowers. Like Michel van Muscher, using this type of loosely bound silk robe became a hallmark of artist Caspar Nescher, whose paintings are often variations of his portrait of Wolters. This portrait dates only 3 years earlier than Van Muscher's 1686 painting of Hude, while the mathematics lesson dates to 1671. Over that decade, there's a noticeable shift to this trend for brightly patterned bizarre silks, with designs often influenced by Japanese textile design. While the lining of Wolters' robe remains unpatterned, the outer layer of the garment has been updated from earlier planar versions of yaponzoroken. In addition to imported silks, yaponzoroken were also made with silks woven in the Netherlands with an asymmetrical pattern. These two robes were both made in Japan and imported. They featured asymmetrical patterns, fans and maple leaves painted on the white silk and peonies on the light blue silk, and are characterized by dynamic diagonals, novel colors, and geometric motifs. The influence of such designs began to filter into European manufacture. For example, a brocaded silk woven in the Netherlands with a pattern of turbaned men and winged chariots demonstrates the fashion for Japanese-inspired styles. Like the painted Japanese silk, the pattern is spaced in offset diagonals, suggesting a feeling of movement. The detailed pattern borders on surrealism. A figure rows a boat on the water, but the waterways blend into a garden landscape. From a distance, the design reads as green geometric abstract shapes on a gold background, but it also engages viewers by challenging them to decipher the figural design upon closer looking. This trend for complex patterned silk migrated to the Americas. Unlike English-American settlers who spun and wove in their homes, colonists in New Netherland relied mostly on imported textiles. According to the Provisional Regulations of 1624, Dutch colonists were explicitly forbidden to participate in making trade goods. Silk, in particular, was persistently linked to industry in Europe and foreign imports. Often, seamstresses working in New Amsterdam would tailor the silk that their clients had special ordered. This dress, now in the MFA Boston, is made of a satin tissue brocaded in colored silks and metal thread, with a pattern that similarly shows chinoiserie figures, rowing boats around an isolated island with trees, repeating in offset diagonals on a larger scale. Although the dress is now fashioned in the style popular in the 1770s, the silk dates to the 1730s. That this garment was altered speaks to the value of the material. The practice of reusing fabrics was standard and part of a strategy of frugality, although it might be less commonly done with patterned silks because they went out of fashion more quickly than plainer silks or more subtle damask silks. In the Americas, when patterned silks are listed in probates, they are often the most expensive item. Each patterned silk was desirable because they encompassed the concept of global exchange and exclusive personal luxury. The textile for the dress was woven in the Netherlands, influenced by Japanese decorative practices, and ultimately consumed in the Americas. Part 3, Patroon Portraiture. With few conventionally trained portrait painters immigrating to New Amsterdam, sign painters and other craftsmen originated an early American style of painting that drew on Dutch and British portrait traditions using standard poses and settings. Between 1690 and 1750, Dutch patroons typically sought out a few known painters, including Everett, Hewitt, and Gerardus Duyckink and Nehemiah Partridge, to paint their portraits. Although late 18th century artists often modeled their paintings after British mezzotints, early portrait painters looked to Dutch models brought from the Netherlands. The earliest Dutch settlers rarely brought paintings with them from Europe or commissioned portraits, but later 17th century inventory showed that a large number of wealthier households did own paintings. Subsequently, portraits painted in New Netherlands or New York that date between 1650 and 1730 distinctly featured subjects wearing a ponselrokken and bizarre silk patterns. Typically, upper-middle-class men, often with ties to trade, would choose this style of dress. Colonel Gerardus Beekman, for example, was a doctor and an elder of Flatbush Church, as well as the son of West India Company Commissary Wilhelmus or William Beekman. As in the Dutch portraits, the sleeves and collar of his rich brown robe are turned to expose the blue silk lining. Other portraits, such as Gerrit Duyckink's painting of an unidentified man, feature sitters in patterned gowns, likely brocaded silk. Neither portrait is painted with as much realism as the portraits of Netscher and Van Muscher, but the patroon artist still managed to convey the quality of the silk material. Although painted in a different style, the three-quarters profile pose of Beekman and the unidentified man mirrors that of Wolters. Also like Wolters, the men wear their silk robes over a cravat and a more traditional European formal dress, indicating that they were dressed for refined leisure, not just in dressing gowns. These similarities suggest that Dutch American men were consciously looking to European portrait conventions to fashion their own paintings. Portraits were not simply commissioned for private enjoyment. They were a public expression of identity. As Dutch burghers dressed in exotic finery to demonstrate their wealth and status, Dutch American patroons adopted European conventions to indicate personal alliances with the political center, enhancing their authority as leading figures in the colonial world. So let's return now to Isaac de Peyster. The de Peyster family were prominent in colonial New York. Isaac's father, Johannes de Peyster, emigrated to New Netherland to escape religious persecution. He was an important member of the government of New Amsterdam and one of the last to take the oath of allegiance to the British Crown once they had taken control of the territory. In addition, Isaac's siblings owned large real estate holdings and held major civic offices in New York. Both his brothers, Abraham and Johannes, served as mayors of New York in the 1690s, and Isaac himself was a member of the provincial legislature. Despite their extensive involvement in colonial politics, the de Peysters remained connected to their Dutch heritage and homeland through their mercantile concerns. Just before Isaac sat for this portrait, his brother Johannes had just returned from traveling to Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and London. It's possible that Johannes reported the fashion in Europe to his brother, or even brought back a swath of silk for him. In addition, Isaac's brother Abraham married his second cousin Katerina when visiting Amsterdam in 1684. When the couple moved back to New York, they brought with them a 1683 portrait of Pierre de Peyster, Katerina's father, in which he wears a Japonserrock. The portrait was displayed in the large sitting room of Abraham and Katerina's Pearl Street home, prominently visible to all their guests. Perhaps Pierre's portrait encouraged Isaac to commission his own, updated to feature a more extravagant bizarre silk. What do we make, then, of Isaac's choice to be painted in a style that consciously emulates European portraiture conventions, but in this ostentatious, densely patterned silk? Zara Anish Chanslin has noted that the patterned silks were uncommon in colonial portraiture. Unpatterned silks were much easier to paint and less likely to date a portrait since patterns came in and out of vogue. Perhaps we can read Isaac's portrait not simply as a document of momentary fashion, but as a self-conscious performance of Dutch-American identity. These portraits were legible as markers of wealth and power to the new British American government. At the same time, they were also unmistakably Dutch in their details. That the fashion amongst Dutch Americans for posing in Japonserrocken developed in the years after New Netherland was ceded to the English is not necessarily contradictory. A transfer of power made Dutch American settlers much more conscious of their own identity and perhaps spurred transatlantic merchant families to emphasize their connection to the Netherlands, especially since these linkages were essential to their livelihood. In dressing in a Japanese-influenced fashion, in high-quality textiles woven in Europe, and within a portrait painted in New York, Dutch American merchants signaled their participation in a global society, while establishing an American identity with deep ties to their Netherlandish roots. Isaac's portrait refers consciously to this specific moment in Dutch American history. The cut of his garment links him to Japan and the Dutch international trading empire. The patterned silk connects him to a European textile industry and the height of European fashion, and the style of the painting, visibly distinct from Van Muscher's depiction of Pierre de Peyster, grounds him in colonial America. Likewise, other members of leading families in the Americas consciously styled themselves in Netherlandish fashions that conveyed sophistication and a continuation of Dutch society. Ultimately, the end of the 18th century saw a shift away from patterned silks, in part because rising tensions between England and its North American colonies interrupted the importation of European goods. There was increasingly less of a distinction between Dutch and British America. In addition, the sheen of exoticism had worn off, and Japanese-inspired patterns and clothing fell out of fashion as the Dutch East India Company lost their monopoly on trade with Japan. As the garment itself was phased out, silk robes and bizarre patterns no longer appeared in portraits, but for a brief period in the waning years of the Dutch Golden Age, Japonserrocken symbolized wealth, status, and erudition for a merchant class that traversed the Dutch globe, from Japan to Amsterdam to the Americas. Thank you.
So next up, we have Ben Green. Ben's a first-year graduate student here in our own Parsons History of Design Curatorial Studies at Cooper Hewitt, where his academic interests lie in mid-19th to mid-20th century American art and design. He's also a curatorial fellow in the museum's Product Design and Decorative Arts Department and interns at the American Wing at the Metropolitan Museum, where he is currently conducting research for an upcoming exhibition on Edward C. Moore and Tiffany Company silver. Today, however, we will be continuing a kind of micro-sub-theme on costume and fashion in New York, though jumping ahead a few centuries. And Ben's paper will propose to re-examine the narrative of New York's superseding Paris as the center of the fashion industry in the mid-20th century. It is entitled, Constructing the American Look, New York's Emergence as a Global Fashion Capital. Ben?
In February 1941, Vogue published an entire issue dedicated to the fashion industry in the United States. Nearly every feature in the magazine dealt with the U.S. fashion industry's response to being cut off from European, particularly French designs, ultimately arguing for the emergence and strength of domestic design. An article titled "American Fashion on Its Own" closed with a call to arms, almost willing an American look into being, saying, quote, "This formed, independent national taste will not be like French taste was before this war. It will be American taste, cultivated by discrimination, appreciation, honesty, observation. If we really want it to be, it can be a real expression of our own land," unquote. This issue of Vogue is one example of many in which the American press during the early 1940s expressed anxiety over the changing nature of the fashion industry. I would argue that the introduction of an American look in the late 1930s and throughout the 1940s was a self-conscious, propagandistic effort on behalf of the US fashion industry and popular press that allowed for New York City to emerge as a global fashion capital. In my presentation, I will briefly examine the ways in which women's interest magazines, such as Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and Ladies' Home Journal, as well as general publications, such as the New York Times, Life, Time, and other periodicals, underscored the hopes, fears, and anxieties for the future of fashion, both at the onset of World War II and as the war came to an end. This will be put into context with other social, cultural, and economic factors that contributed to the construction of the American look. And as a brief case study, I looked to the American designer, Claire McCardle, to show that the binary between Paris and New York as fashion capitals is perhaps more ambiguous than it appears. From the reign of Louis XIV to the onset of World War II, Paris unquestioningly held the title of fashion capital of the world. Until the German invasion of France in 1940, popular sources considered Parisian couturiers as the arbiters of taste and style. Under Nazi rule, though, Paris's role in the fashion industry began to shift. Until this point, designers and clothing manufacturers in the United States typically relied on French designs that were then copied and spread throughout fashionable crowds in America. These designs were cheaper than the haute couture offered in Paris, and they were more readily available. After the spring of 1940, though, the United States was completely shut off from French fashion because of restrictions on travel and trade. Articles began to appear not only in women's interest magazines, but also in general newspapers, which presented the question, what will happen to fashion now that Paris, its exemplar, has been ousted? The fact that no one knew how long the war would prolong magnified this uncertainty. These articles express not only America's anxiety over this question, but also a desperate need to prove itself in the absence of French influence. At its core, an Emersonian call for self-reliance. In 1940, as questions surrounding the fate of Paris as the fashion capital arose, an answer just as quickly appeared. New York City would subsume the position, or at least according to US writers. The idea that Paris was a place of inspiration, whereas New York simply existed as a manufacturing locale, became outmoded. The writers of the time used language and advertising to exploit the material framework that already existed. As this page from Harper's Bazaar visually connects 7th Avenue with a patriotic color scheme and motifs, we see that New York City becomes a metonym for, among other things, American fashion. As mentioned earlier, there were issues of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar dedicated exclusively to American fashion, completely ignoring the precedents of Parisian designs. Any memory of Parisian fashion was being replaced by the American look. The press now overtly advertised it as an integral component to the United States identity, an identity characterized by ease, democracy, and comfort. Both semantically and visually, fashion magazines often paired these values with notions of the West or expansion. Though in some contexts they became associated with ideas of modernism and progress, they equally became treated as emblems of a rustic heritage deeply rooted in an American psychology. As this article from Harper's Bazaar indicates, American fashions fell into the same vein as Uncle Tom's Cabin, Matthew Brady's Civil War photography, Burl Ives' music, Buffalo Bill, and superheroes. In this context, fashion originating in New York City were a logical extension of the American experience. An article from the New York Times reads, "For on that June day of 1940, when Paris surrendered, the domination of the fashion world which the French capital had exercised for centuries ceased forthwith. New York woke up simultaneously to a responsibility and a natural role as inheritor of that tradition, unquote. New York fashion designers fulfilled this void, but in the moment, their staying power was uncertain. In 1945, as the war was nearing an end, the textual tug of war, which appeared at the beginning of the war, reared its head again. The question now was, when Paris is liberated, will New York remain a or the leader in fashion? Overwhelmingly, the popular press responded with two answers. In one camp, reporters argued that New York completely replaced Paris as the capital of the fashion world. Another group thought that Paris and New York would coexist as fashion leaders. So pressing was this question that the Saturday Evening Post published its story, Paris, USA, a multi-page polemic in 1944, singularly addressing what they called a multi-million-dollar question. The story was even dramatized on the radio. Ignoring the deference historically shown towards France, the writer stated, quote, its continental rival, meaning France, will no longer be the fashion mecca towards which American women will instinctively turn to bob abject curtsies of obeisance, unquote. Other influential figures in fashion, such as fashion editor of the Chicago Tribune, Ray Seeger, agreed, vehemently advocating for the preeminence of New York designs. She wrote, quote, we no longer debate the comparative values of American versus French. American fashions have arrived and are here to stay, unquote. Other authors and critics were more realistic, suggesting that Paris and New York would coexist as fashion capitals. Samuel Zahn, the chairman of the New York Dress Institute, assured members that both cities had their respective places in the industry, de-emphasizing any sense of rivalry, yet reinforcing the binary between inspiration and production, which permeated discourse at the beginning of the war. At a luncheon held by the fashion group called Fashion at International Crossroads, the consensus was that New York would remain a great powerhouse, creating mass-produced fashions, while Paris would be restored as a center dedicated to inspiration and beautiful, detailed workmanship. This arrangement arguably still exists today, with both cities remaining at the forefront of fashion. Though I have focused primarily on the textual evidence supporting the idea of New York as a global fashion capital, there were clearly other economic, social, and cultural factors at play during the war. For example, Mayor of New York LaGuardia knew that the fashion industry provided substantial economic stimulation for New York City, and he wanted to maintain, if not capitalize upon this opportunity. He also thought that Hollywood had the potential to claim this role, so he joined the campaign to support fashion designers in New York City. In January of 1941, he boldly proclaimed, quote, New York is now the fashion center of the world. I don't see why we have to take our fashion from any other country, and I hope to see the time come when people will be copying New York models, unquote. His involvement went beyond merely being the face of the city on the fashion industry's behalf. He actually formed committees which investigated ways in which to support and expand the industry for designers and buyers. In addition to the general reporting on the future of industry during this war, semi-annual press weeks were held in New York City to display the newest American fashions, beginning in 1943. We now call these events New York Fashion Week. Virginia Pope, fashion editor and reporter for the New York Times from 1933 to 1955, hosted semi-annual fashion shows called Fashions of the Times. These fashion shows presented an opportunity for American fashions to be put on display and were widely publicized and reported upon. Pope has been cited as the originator of fashion reportage and is also to thank for her prioritization of ready-to-wear fashions. By reporting on the work being done on 7th Avenue before it reached stores, she helped promote an egalitarian view of fashion that contrasted Parisian couture. As mentioned earlier, one of the most profound differences between the fashion industries of Paris and New York was the context in which the designers were considered. Whereas Parisian designers were celebrities in their own right, American designers were completely anonymous. In the United States, it was the manufacturer who people knew, not the hand behind the mass-produced item. Mary Lewis, a fashion consultant, noted in the New York Times on July 2, 1940, that for American designs to take a hold of the popular imagination, and if there was any chance of legitimately competing with French designs, then 7th Avenue would need to be replaced with actual designers' names. Even in the 1930s, department stores had begun to undertake this effort. As early as 1932, Dorothy Shaver, who went on to become president of Lord & Taylor department store, began to promote American designs through her window displays. She made sure to name the designers. By putting American designers' work on a pedestal, she gave credence to the New York fashion industry and recontextualized these designers' role in the fashion industry. Lord & Taylor further embraced the American designers by trademarking the phrase, "the American look," in 1945. They also added the subtitle, "the signature of American style," to their name. The department store's ads made sure to list the names of the American designers whose work they sold. In fact, when Life ran a cover story in May of 1945 that focused on 10 American designers, a week later the department store responded with an ad in the New York Times. They pointed out, quote, "First of all, what's this furor over only 10 leading American designers? In this great country of ours? Come, come, Life magazine. We'd say it should be over many times that number," unquote. At the end of the war, executives and department stores remained committed to supporting American designers, even once trade reopened with Europe. Besides these commercial enterprises, there were also institutional efforts to promote American design during World War II. In the early 1940s, the Ladies' Garment Workers Union and the New York Dress Institute took up the same effort to promote the work of American designers. The union raised funds to research ways in which New York City could be better promoted as a fashion center, and they also encouraged more efficient production. The Dress Institute took part in the press weeks and introduced efforts to resist the possibility of production decline during the war. Additionally, the Costume Institute, which eventually merged with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, legitimized American fashion by placing it within a museum setting, providing weight to the claim that American fashion was worthy of study and veneration. When looking at the discourses surrounding the intersections of fashion between New York and Paris, and soon after World War II, it becomes clear that though technical and aesthetic difference existed between the work produced in each city, the primary difference is in the ways in which we talk about them. This is the construction of the American look. As a way to assert its presence and power, the American press and fashion industry projected a vision of itself, a vision of Paris, and most importantly, of New York in comparison to Paris. In the same way that the popular press pitted American and French designs against each other, Claire McCardle's work and image have been constructed as purely American without leaving room for any ambiguity. Just as these visions of New York City were in part social constructions, Claire McCardle's designs fall into a liminal space between a uniquely American perspective and yet a natural progression in the international history of fashion. Though there's a material difference between her work and the work of French couturiers, when put under scrutiny, her work in some ways seems indebted to French design. Claire McCardle is often described as the quintessential American fashion designer. Both her personal attitude and biography, as well as her clothes, supposedly emulate what it means to be American. Beryl Williams, who wrote biographical sketches of McCardle and her contemporaries, wrote, quote, "Fashion writers search for a phrase to describe Claire McCardle, almost inevitably settle upon one that begins with the words, as American as, ... And with less originality, perhaps, but just as pointedly, she has been referred to over and over again, simply as typically American," unquote. With her functional and relatively casual sportswear designs, along with their comparative affordability, the objects themselves become cited as visual expressions of democracy, egalitarianism, and freedom, an American approach to fashion. In Time's 1955 tribute to her, the author wrote, quote, "She borrows styles from no one," with Diana Vreeland agreeing, saying, quote, "She gave the American woman a look of her own, and she did it without outside pressures," unquote. In a Women's Wear Daily article from 1943, the writer states that she is, quote, "one of the few American wholesale designers untouched by Paris influence," unquote. The fashion model Susie Parker even described McCardle as refreshingly un-French. Despite all of these claims that McCardle is the total American and the antithesis of French, there were instances in her life and career when the important role of France shone through. It was not until the mid-1940s that she became fully branded as a disciple of the American look. I think it's worth considering how McCardle may have capitalized upon her branding as an American designer. As a smart businesswoman, it seems plausible that she fully embraced this depiction, for before this, she was overt in her genuflection to Paris. In an article from Women's Wear Daily in 1940, the author writes, quote, "Paris has contributed more to her design inspiration than any other factor," unquote. Later quoting McArdle herself, who said, quote, "I have enough Paris ideas to last 6 months, and after that, I have as good a chance as the rest of them," unquote. In fact, when briefly looking at her biography, it seems clear that Paris greatly influenced her burgeoning career. McArdle attended Parsons School of Design in New York City and then enrolled in the Paris campus. While living in Paris, she was able to work as a fashion sketcher, as well as study French designs up close, examining the structures of the costumes. The Parsons Paris course catalogs indicate that students at the time had the opportunity to visit fashion houses, as well as witness the semi-annual openings of designers such as Vionnet, Worth, Chanel, Pateau, Poiret, and others. McArdle mentions in her autobiography that she would buy cheap versions of the couture dresses and take them apart so that she could learn from their construction. Surely these formative experiences informed her dressmaking later on in her career. In an interview comparing the future of American fashion in a post-World War II world, McArdle said, quote, "I shall go on making clothes to solve the American problems of ease and comfort. I love Paris, and I shall certainly go back there," unquote. It's not incompatible to imagine a designer who appreciates and is perhaps inspired by exquisite fashions of France, yet can still produce inventive, ready-to-wear designs. Though the press and even scholarly commentary suggest that her work is entirely American, some of her designs seem to take direct inspiration from French designers. In other instances, her designs seem to precede French trends. Rather than designing in a vacuum, McArdle engaged in a natural dialogue with other designers. It has been well documented that McArdle admired and took inspiration from French designers Madeleine Vionnet and Madame Grès in terms of their aesthetics and their fashion sensibility. Though these women and McArdle made clothes for different markets, the clear-cut boundaries between Paris and New York fashion breaks down when comparing the two. Madame Grès most famously designed clothes inspired by Grecian statuary, perfecting a draped aesthetic. McArdle also relied on the power of draped fabrics, using belts or other devices for a cinched waist. In an editorial photo shoot from 1939, McArdle's allusion to Vionnet is undeniable. In February of 1947, Christian Dior released his line, which came to be known as the New Look. His collection was characterized by rounded shoulders, long and full skirts, and tight waists. Interestingly, this has been Claire McArdle's aesthetic throughout the 1940s. Full skirts, no shoulder pad, and a tiny waist. Dior's New Look is cited as an indicator that Paris had been restored as the leader of the fashion world. Despite the popular press's response to the New Look, scholars have now noted that McArdle was ahead of her time. In fact, McArdle predicted in 1945 that, quote, "Skirts are going to be longer and fuller, and shoulders are going to get rounder. I showed rounded shoulders 5 years ago. As for full skirts, mine have been as full as could be from the beginning." Whereas Dior channeled the Belle Epoque look with corsets restraining the waist and petticoats creating fullness in skirts, McArdle achieved the same elegance through her use of belts and free-flowing skirts. The two designers began from the same point, that is, overt femininity and a pendulum shift away from the rationing efforts of the war, but the designers manifest in slightly different ways. I'd like to end by showing you a dress from the Cooper Hewitt's collection. This is a Claire McArdle design dress using fabric inspired by French artist Léger. It is a visual representation of the inextricable link between Parisian and New York designs. Dichotomizing designers ignores the give-and-take nature of inspiration, yet corroborates the idea of a nationalistic branding of fashion. Just as the American press created hyperbolized distinctions between New York and Paris as a way to establish New York City as a formidable fashion capital, the same was done between Claire McArdle and her European counterparts. A 1941 article from the magazine The Living Age noted, quote, "A fashion capital is not created by proclamation," unquote. After briefly examining the evolution of New York City's fashion industry during World War II, though, it seems clear that if the industrial framework already exists, language does have the power to create an international fashion capital. Thank you.
So here's where we would have had another paper on fashion dealing with the 1960s and the manufacture and sale of dashikis in Harlem and its relationship to the black identity movement in the late 60s. Instead, we're going to turn back actually to the Dutch obliquely as we welcome Sarah Mallory to talk about genre painting in early 20th century New York, especially a genre painter, Harry Herman Roseland, who is very much influenced by Dutch genre painting. Sarah Mallory, a PhD student at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York University, holds the Alfred Bader, Paul Lott, and Isabel and Alfred Bader Fellowships for the study of Dutch art, and is also teaching at Parsons. Her work examines relationship between bodies and landscapes in the Dutch Golden Age. She also, of course, has an MA from our very own Parsons Cooper Hewitt program. We're very proud of her. She's worked in the Victoria and Albert Museum, at the Brooklyn Museum, the Frick Collection, and at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So her paper today developed out of her research on the 19th century reception of 17th century Dutch art. In Golden Ghosts, Harry Herman Roseland's Genre Scenes, Sarah examines the work of the once popular Brooklyn-based artist who specialized in scenes of the city's African-American fortune tellers in compositions deeply indebted to Dutch Golden Age paintings. So please welcome Sarah Mallory. And I'm just going to pull up her thing. You are here.
Thank you, and I would like to thank Professor Roby and the selection committee for allowing me to be a part of this wonderful symposium. And I want to mention that I first was exposed to Harry Herman Roseland's work through a thesis I was writing for Professor Harwood. So, all right. This presentation will focus on Harry Herman Roseland's genre scenes, specifically those depicting black female fortune tellers, such as this painting from 1899, now in a private collection. I will examine these paintings not simply as the problematic postbellum works that they are, but also as a 19th century mediation on one of New Amsterdam's longest surviving inheritances, that is, slavery. This presentation will demonstrate how Roseland's application of Dutch Golden Age painting techniques and themes to the depiction of black women puts him in dialogue with the origins of colonialism in America. Roseland's paintings are today an oddity in American museums, though during the artist's lifetime they were well known amongst all manner of art enthusiasts. Over the course of the past 50 years, Roseland's works have been dismissed as shallow, pandering, even arch caricatures that offer viewers little more than postbellum fancy. And indeed, they do elaborate post-Civil War fantasies of black men and women as happy or magical, two forms of racial stereotyping that harken back to the idea of the noble savage. In Roseland's many fortune teller paintings, however, we see this narrative acted out as poor but apparently contented black women use their occult skills not only to improve the circumstances of white women in need of guidance. I would also like to suggest that these images contain an even more complex narrative that stretches much further back into America's colonial past to New Amsterdam. Indeed, a reassessment of Roseland's works, particularly his choice of subject matter, his technique, and his particular use of iconographic elements, reveals his intimate engagement with Dutch Golden Age genre painting, particularly a subgenre dedicated to women reading letters with their maids. To be clear, this presentation is not an attempt to rectify or cleanse the reputation of Roseland, who, at best, could be called ambivalent in his views towards people of color, but rather it's an effort to complicate our understanding of postbellum America through a rereading of Roseland's works. In essence, he harkens back to the visual rhetoric of the Dutch Golden Age to depict black bodies in the 19th century. These bodies, of course, the vestiges of Dutch Golden Age empire. Harry Herman Roseland was an American painter, or more precisely, a New York painter, born and raised in Brooklyn. He never left the borough and is buried in Greenwood Cemetery. Roseland never traveled to Europe to hone his skills, as many of his teachers did, which include J.B. Whittaker, Thomas Eakins, and Carol Beckwith. And these men likely imparted their lessons to Roseland. An 1899 story from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle makes this quite plain. The quote is rather substantial, but I think it's worth reading because it establishes Roseland's relationship to his subject matter, and this is one of the few quotes that actually testifies to that. Quote, Mr. Roseland could not go to Paris, so he went down to the lower end of Flatbush, wondering as he went why he had never noticed before what fine old colonial houses were along the way, and what noble trees, and what splendid reaches of meadows, and what bits of satisfying color in the red barns and yellow sheds, and what misty woods in the distance. Why, there were Normandy and Holland farms. He had been pining for people who wear blue blouses and wooden shoes. But as if to prove that we have all that is needed here in the way of European material, behold, Canarsie turned out a lot of pea pickers, who dressed principally in blue, with an occasional relief of some other color that might have been found in France and Holland. When they were bending to their work in the wide farm fields, who knows that the subject was not pure European, if you wanted to think so. Mr. Roseland saw the abundance of charm in the material and began to paint it. In a little while, however, it began to pale upon him because it was too European. So seeing a subject that he was felt, unquote, seeking a subject he felt was more American, Roseland saw the black men and women living in the tenements of Ocean Hill as ideal models for his genre scenes. During his lifetime, it was widely believed that Roseland's paintings were faithful depictions of Southern black men and women, but he in fact recruited models from amongst these Brooklynites. And he painted the models in a studio filled with props that we see repeatedly amongst his canvases. You'll see rugs, chairs, that sort of thing. Though he began his career as a landscape painter in the 1910 census actually records him as a landscape painter, it was his genre scenes that ultimately built his reputation. During his lifetime, he was a well-known and active member of the New York art scene. He graduated from the Adelphi Academy and was a member of the Salmagundi Club and the Brooklyn Society of Artists. He regularly showed his work across the United States and won numerous design awards from all over the United States. But it was his genre scenes that ultimately earned him his success. So before we look closely at Roseland's works, I've brought you some examples to illuminate his emulation of 17th century Dutch painters. You will see that he combined the loose and rough brushwork of Rembrandt and Frans Hals with the defined silhouettes and play of light reminiscent of Vermeer, Jan Steen, Gabriel Metsu, and others. He also borrowed from the themes of these painters, particularly genre scenes featuring peasants and women in interiors. All of the following examples were known through engravings or in museums in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm not sure if Roseland would have seen any of these works, but they are influential works. That's a picture of his studio. This is Frans Hals' Merry Drinker, which was in the Dutch National Collection by 1816, so observe his rough brushstrokes, which reappear in Roseland's 1894 painting entitled Alone. So I think you can see the similarity of technique there. Here we have Nicholas Maas, The Prayer Without End, and note the clearly defined and articulate strokes imparting a startling realism. Here we have Vermeer's Sleeping Girl, which has also got a velvety stillness. Perhaps she was drunk, that's one interpretation, and this was on display in London as early as 1903 and in the Met in 1909. The disheveled peasant scenes of Steen and Brouwer are also rendered with a rough brushstroke, which at the time was a reflection of a rough moral character in humble conditions. And of course, Adrian van Ostad's 1661 Peasants in an Interior is a superlative example of the peasant genre scene, as is Molinaire's 17th century Saying Grace. Which brings us to Roseland. The ragged interior, rendered in a soft tonal palette coated in a golden light, punctuated with splashes of reds and oranges, the rough brushwork used to depict worn wood floors and tattered garments juxtaposed with the smoother, more naturalistic treatment of the young girl's profile. Here we see Roseland's treatment of the money counter theme, which was a particular specialization of the early modern Netherlandish painters. Rembrandt also depicted this subject, which you can see an example of here. Roseland's interpretation of the man's hands vaguely refers to things that we've seen in these other paintings. And we see him doing something, Roseland doing something different than some of his contemporaries, which many were influenced by the old masters, but he's inserting black bodies into a narrative that they hadn't been present in before. And Rosalind was not alone in his regard for these Golden Age masters. His tendencies reflect a well-documented phenomenon of 19th century painters, including Courbet and Manet, looking to and copying Golden Age masters. While much has been said on this subject, we'll just let John Singer Sargent's quote suffice. Quote, "Someday you must assert that the only painters were Velázquez, Frans Hals, Rembrandt, and Vandermeer Vermeer of Delft, a tremendous man." For American artists, the appeal of Dutch painters extended beyond the aesthetic. The strong presence in America of a Holland mania was part of the U.S. larger project of nationhood and revolution, both rather hot topics after the decades following the Civil War. The history of the Netherlands was a panacea for those looking for a way to reconcile the paradox of civil war, as that nation too was born from similar circumstances. And coincidentally, more than 100 years before the Civil War, Benjamin Franklin called the Dutch Golden Age, quote, "our great example, a proper and seasonable mirror for the Americans embroiled in a revolution," unquote. Americans, particularly residents of New York, were also enthusiastically rediscovering their Dutch colonial roots. The 1909 Hudson-Fulton celebrations, for example, saw New Yorkers enraptured in the 300th anniversary of the discovery of the namesake river. This was accompanied by an exhibition in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that featured many 17th century Dutch paintings. And previous to that, when the Met opened its doors in 1872, Henry James's review praised the pictures, quote, "we especially associate with the Dutch school, genre subjects, rustic groups, landscapes." In this context of Holland mania, Rosalind's work represents an intriguing rereading of history. For while he deliberately uses Dutch Golden Age pictorial devices and techniques, he consistently does something only rarely done in the 17th century. He inserts black bodies into the painting's narratives. He is using the warm propaganda of the Dutch Golden Age to try and mediate the bitter end of their post-colonial plans, because it was the Dutch, after all, who introduced slavery to New Amsterdam, and it was the Dutch who turned it into an industry in the same city. Without question, Rosalind's paintings document America's not-so-distant past. In the lopsided power dynamic that we see of the white woman and the softening of poverty that renders the black woman subservient, we can see the potent traces of slavery that began with colonialization and ostensibly ended with the Emancipation Proclamation. But we know this was not entirely the case. And we sometimes see a disturbing acceptance of this poverty in Rosalind's canvases. But his depictions of black men and women actually connects with an even longer colonial history traceable to Dutch and Flemish art of the 16th and 17th centuries. And briefly, here are some other 19th century American painters who were also depicting black bodies. Jean-Michel Massing has observed a painting in the Low Countries that in the 16th and 17th centuries, the image of black people was conveyed above all, and especially to those who had never seen Eyes of an African, through the theme of the adoration of the Magi. And he says, "While there were many reasons for the popularity of the adoration of the Magi, its imagery clearly reflects the visual culture of a mercantile society in a city that had become, after the Portuguese circumnavigation of Africa linking the Mediterranean and Atlantic trade with that of the Indian Ocean and China Sea, a major commercial center in the newly globalized world. So thus, as trade increased, in turn increasing the demand for enslavement of people, so too did the demand to see the black magus. During this period, Dutch and Flemish artists also began inserting black women into allegorical scenes, and they often represented the figure of darkness as a foil to light, darkness meaning someone who had not been illuminated by Christ's word, and the fair-skinned woman as someone who had been. But on the whole, the relative scarcity of black or brown bodies in Dutch Golden Age painting does not acknowledge the vastness of the nation's slave trade, nor the incredible financial gains made off the back of slaves. The tradition informing Rosalind's subjugation of black women then stretches back to the earliest stages of the Dutch Empire. Is it irony or deeply embedded visual rhetoric that led him to depict black bodies in the golden ghostly glow 17th century Dutch paintings? I believe that Rosalind's fortune tellers also fit within a particular subset of Golden Age genre scenes, which involve the writing and receiving of letters. And I'll take a moment to just comment that these are 4 examples of the fortune teller paintings that are under discussion. And then you see women reading tea leaves, having a palm read, reading cards. In this upper corner, this is someone having their fortune read through a crystal, right? But back to the letter writing. This was a genre that was innovated in 1631, and in these pictures, women are often accompanied by female servants, and there's often an undertone of loose morals here, that a woman is receiving an illicit letter from a lover. Sometimes it's bad news, but often it has shady moral undertones. Okay, so here you can see an example of Vermeer, and this is the love letter, and that's one interpretation of this picture. We also have another Vermeer. This is in the Frick collection, which is Mistress and Maid. Here we also have some scenes from the Dutch Golden Age where you see the rare depiction of a servant of color. So I'm just kind of showing you the connection there. Okay. Roseland's The Letter of 1898 shows a young white woman dressed in soft white gown with delicate pink flowers. A straw bonnet bedecked with roses and greenery crowns her soft blonde curls. She perches atop an old green Windsor-style chair, staring intently at the letter she holds in her hands. Across from her, an elderly black woman clad in a ragged white apron holds the envelope, gently leaning forward as if awaiting some news. There seems to be a bond between the women, one very clearly mirroring the other's posture, though the origins of the connection are unclear. We might see in this scene an indictment of the woman's character and the black woman as her conspirator. And I think we shouldn't resist comparing this scene to something like the much-studied composition of Rembrandt's Bathsheba receiving David's letter. In Rembrandt's highly innovative and influential canvas, we see was in the Louvre's collection by 1869, we see a ponderous Bathsheba holding a letter in her hand, considering her past and inevitable future as King David's lover. Both artists contrast the beauty of the young woman and the old woman. And I will say, according to newspaper articles, this was definitely something Roseland was trying to do. And if he received any criticism at the time, it was that his white women were just almost too pretty. This should also be read in the context of some other art which is going on at the time, which is Winslow Homer's A Visit from the Old Mistress. Here we see black women resisting the idea of a white woman coming to visit them. So this is sort of, I would put in opposition to the kind of scene that Roseland is trying to depict, the story that he's trying to tell. Okay. Roseland Sue substitutes the letter iconography for other more blatant symbols of questionable behavior, for example, playing cards, which were just such a no-no in Dutch Golden Age paintings. Genre pictures, card-playing scenes represent sexual promiscuity or immoral behavior. Roseland's fortune teller uses playing cards rather than tarot cards to divine the future of her willing client. Here, the future rather than the letter is read, though the inclusion of the cards would suggest this interlude is morally suspect, but beyond cards, palms and tea leaves are two more forms of reading that Roseland uses in his paintings. So again, we start with the letter, and then we move into reading other things. And here's an example of a Dutch scene where the woman is very sensually looking at us while playing cards, the implication being she's sort of playing the men against one another for her affections. So the men are absent from Roseland's scene in a way, but I will address that in just a moment. I also will note that this very famous painting was sort of rediscovered again in the 19th century. It's Frans Hal, and it was originally at the time seen as sort of a witchy woman, somebody who was involved in these sort of occult practices. And again, I want to point out the similarity in the technique, painting technique. While Roseland's juxtaposition between the older magical women and their younger white companions is an exceptionally problematic stereotyping of black women, I would suggest there's one aspect of these pictures that unites the subjects in a form of subversive behavior against an oppressive moral majority. That is their mutual belief in the occult practice of fortune-telling. 19th and early 20th century social reform movements, particularly those associated with universal suffrage and abolitionism, were frequently associated with acts of occultism, such as seances, divination, and fortune-telling. Perhaps not surprisingly, these behaviors were also associated with some sects of abolitionists, though we have no indication of Roseland's feelings on the topic. His urge to picture women together in the space of poverty and alternative spiritual practices outside the Judeo-Christian tradition perhaps acknowledges their shared struggle for equality, although it's very important to note that this in of itself is perpetrating another sort of stereotype, which is that in feminism, black women and white women share equal burden, and it has been pointed out in recent scholarship that this is also sort of a falsehood to equate this sort of suffering, which is not the same. But back to the men issue, which is that though we could look at this through the lens of feminism, what Rosalind is really sort of saying, I think, also in connection with the Dutch Golden Age, is that what isn't in these scenes are the men. There aren't babies. This is not a refined atmosphere, right? And so in a way, it's a commentary. So in the Dutch Golden Age, this is what you would have strived to have as a woman: a beautiful home in front of the hearth with children. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the women in these fortune teller scenes do not have those things. So there's yet another layer of oral interpretation, which harkens back to the Dutch Golden Age, visible in this. The popular response to Rosalind's work stands in contrast to the ambiguity of his own intentions in depicting black men and women. By the late 1930s, Rosalind's fashionable style of painting now appeared old-fashioned. And I'll say that in 1950, the year of his death, his average income was $750, which was lower than the average of $1,368. So we can read that maybe as one sign of his waning popularity. For much of Rosalind's life, his genre scenes appeared with great regularity in exhibitions and galleries. These works were typically oil paintings and were regularly reproduced via print and appeared with great regularity in national newspapers and magazines. Scenes were used on other forms of print ephemera. For example, here we have his painting, which is called Was It for the Best, now in the collection of the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and it was reproduced by the Gerlach Barlow Calendar Company in Joliet, Illinois, which was then one of the most popular commercial printing factories, and it remained so until 1950. Rosalind was well aware of the commercial potential of his works of art, regularly copywriting them to prevent fraudulent or unauthorized reproductions. In an April 1908 letter to the American Art News, Rosalind, who wrote the publication to inform them that they had incorrectly identified, quote, a rank copy of the worst type of one of his paintings, declared, quote, I have been troubled many times before under similar conditions, though my pictures, as a rule, are copyrighted by me to stop just such a thing, but it seems to do no good, end quote. He also notes the picture in question, which I have not been able to identify, but it would have looked something like this, which was an engraving in a newspaper article about him, that it, quote, had been reproduced hundreds of thousands of times, having been, as a supplement with one of the New York Sunday papers, the copy artist leaving out one of the figures to ease his conscience, if he has any, unquote. And I think it's rather interesting on several counts that Rosalind would have framed the unauthorized use of his work as a matter of conscience, when his work is so deeply indebted to the exploitation of black bodies, to the innovation of 17th century Dutch painters, and when the theme of his pictures is so often centered on an exploration of the conscience. Be it through the modern eye, the question could be whose conscience, that of the viewer, the artist, or the subject depicted. Some of Rosalind's depictions were recognized in their time for their ability to send powerful moral messages. Alone, which I've showed you before, was one such example, and it was printed to accompany a Demarest's monthly article on poverty in New York, and it was full page, full color, and sort of on a thicker paper in a publication where everything else was black and white on flimsy newsprint. So I think it was seen as fairly significant. Perhaps Rosalind's most well-known painting today, which is entitled To the Highest Bidder, from 1906, depicts a mother and her child moments before they will likely be separated forever on the auction block. This deeply moving work is rendered in a rough brushwork style reminiscent of that of Rembrandt or Velázquez. This same image was used on the January 1916 cover of The Crisis, the magazine of the NAACP. The magazine would have published this under the guidance of Dubois, and whether he knew or had any opinion about Rosalind's fortune teller art remains unknown, but we do know that he felt, quote, all art is propaganda. Therefore, in this instance, we may be assured that he at least felt this canvas advanced his agenda, which was to, quote, set forth those facts and arguments which show the danger of race prejudice, particularly as manifested towards today's people of color, excuse me. Beyond this, we must make up our own minds by carefully examining the deep history embedded in Rosalind's postbellum painting. As a New York painter, perhaps he was in a unique position to mediate the city's Dutch Golden Age past and its vision of a new Gilded Age. But again, we must make up our own minds. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask the three speakers to come up or either, I suppose we don't need to be so formal about it. If there are any questions from the audience, we can have a Q&A session now, so that you don't have to wait till this afternoon to, hold your questions. So I just ask, there should be microphones going around so we can pick up your questions on the video. We have microphones up here too. So does anyone want to? Yeah.
I have two questions. Ben, who retailed Claire McCardle's fashions in New York first? Where were her clothes sold?
Well, she initially didn't have her own line. She was working for Hattie Carnegie. Yeah.
Okay, but who was the first retailer to sell them? Do you know?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. Perhaps I'd have to look it up.
Okay,
I'm not sure.
I'd be curious to know. Sarah, one question. Has anything been written about the great exaggeration of color of the black and white people in some of the paintings?
No, and in fact, Rosalind is just somebody who gets ignored altogether because I think people see, they observe the gross caricature that's happening
Right.
there, and so he's just really dismissed, but I think that's a good point.
Because they're very interesting, but they are greatly exaggerated, the color tones.
Question for each of the panelists, real quick. Cynthia, I love those silks. Oh my gosh, those are so beautiful. Because it comes back though in the mid-late 19th century, right? People start wearing paisley robes, right? American artists in that Orientalist fantasy, right? I guess I'm giving you another idea for another. Did you look into those? Did those turn up in your research?
So yeah, that's definitely something that I'm interested in pursuing in maybe a more extended project. And even though I talk about this as a very limited period, I have to say that the trend never fully goes away. These, I think, are predecessors to the banyans that are popular in the South and in Boston and other parts of colonial America in the late 18th and early 19th century. And so they keep coming up in paintings in different iterations, and I really want to parse out all the differences in where these objects are coming from, what are their predecessors, and India and like painted cottons really become a big part of this trend too later on. So yeah, thanks.
Right, because I think the menswear show at RISD had William Trost Richards' own robe, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
Sarah, real quick, Roseland's papers don't survive. We don't know what he was thinking, right?
So some papers are at the Salmagundi Club, but just very few. It's really hard to know what he was thinking. I would love to know. And there are newspaper articles that I wasn't able to include in this where there are more quotes. There are more offensive quotes, frankly, of things he said. So, but again, people saw, there are some instances where the work was somehow seen as redeeming in some fashion. So it's a very confusing time.
Because those women look helpless in some ways, right? This precious China doll who can't determine her own future, right? It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And then last question, Ben, I'm gonna put you in touch with my mom because her mom worked for Hattie Carnegie, and my mom insists that her mother invented the poodle skirt in the 40s. Okay,
Perfect.
I'll send you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question for Sarah. Could you talk a little bit about that image in Architectural Digest? Was it? The highest
yeah,
bidder.
sorry.
I'm just wondering, what was pictured there and
Yes, I'm
whose
sorry.
home it was. And I'm just curious.
The painting is now in the collection of Oprah Winfrey, and that was a picture of it above her mantle.
Okay, cool.
Which I'm sorry I couldn't talk about more, but I haven't been there and seen it myself, so it is. This according to everything I've read, that's where it is. But
That makes sense.
Thank you very much, actually, for all three speakers for actually wonderful talks. They were fascinating. First, I have a quick question for Sarah. I wasn't quite clear. Was Roseland an African-American artist himself? No. Okay.
No.
Okay. Thank you. And then I had a question for Cynthia about the use of the robes in both the Dutch culture, but also here in New York. Were they used in public at all, or is it just kind of at home, a kind of at home costume?
No, they'd never be worn out in public, but they were for leisure at home. So working in an office or in a library space, and the only way they would be seen, I think, by people who are not in the immediate family is through these portraits, which would be hung in a public home in a public space within the home.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Just a good question for Sarah. So it's interesting that I think that you make all the compelling connections to the Dutch Golden Age. I do find interesting though that the meeting of two different kinds of classes is actually not something we see so much in Dutch Golden Age, and so I'm curious what your take is on how he mixes that particular those kinds of genres of the tavern scene with the women at home, and whether it is based on some kind of understanding of this being a place where these women of different classes could meet.
That is a really good question. I hadn't quite thought of it that way, but yeah, maybe it's just part of his blending process of that 19th century, like the discriminating eye, but the undiscriminating eye in a way. And they are a little bit of a fancy, because I think it was important for him to try and make it seem like, oh yes, everybody can come together, but at the same time, he's sort of undercutting that point by glamorizing the poverty in a way. So, but I think that's a really good point that you make.
It doesn't seem like the kind of thing where he probably himself never experienced that kind of space and that kind of encounter. So yeah, it's very interesting.
I mean, for him, it was so picturesque, and that says a lot right there.
Yeah.
I have a question. I think this rhetoric of the American designer is so fascinating, and I was wondering whether or not that actually played out in the way that these fashions were consumed. Were people buying into this idea of the American designer?
Definitely, and I didn't include this, but another part of the rhetoric was, they were very outward about the fact that if we are going to be leaders, you're going to have to buy it. There wasn't, and so they did. So that was talked about in the discourse as well.
So there's an interesting coda to this. In the post-war, I think it's 46, that the French couture houses, are you familiar with the dolls, the fashion dolls? So they're sort of 2.5 feet high, and there are several dozen of them. And it was a post-war thank you from the French fashion industry to the United States. And they were done by all the big couture houses, and they are these elaborately hand-done dress dolls, and they traveled all over the country. They were shown in museums and public spaces, and then at the end, they came to live at the Brooklyn Museum, where they were for ages, but it was so it was advertised as a thank you for the American people of having supported the war, but it was clearly an effort by the French couture houses to drum up business again after the war. And they now live at the Metropolitan Museum, but we're going to show them again at Brooklyn. And so it's a really interesting footnote to this whole thing. And Sarah, I noticed that the costumes of the white women in these pictures, they're not contemporary 1890s, 1900 outfits. Some of them are dressed in clearly 1820s, 1840s outfits. What do you make of that?
Two things. So at the time, in the same breath that people were saying Rosalind's women were too pretty, they were also saying he's making them into fashion plates. So at the time, they're being interpreted as somehow fashionable or apropos of fashion. So that's
but they're not modern.
No. So the other thing I would say is it is probably also part of his idea of imagining either the good old days or just, again, his kind of fantasy of these things happening, which of course I strongly suspect he never actually witnessed.
So some of those scenes he's setting in antebellum times.
Yeah.
Essentially.
I would think so.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it's time some museum was brave enough to get these paintings back on the wall and ask what was going on here. I mean, it's really...
They're in, yeah. So one is in the Brooklyn Museum.
Yes.
And that was
and
not an accusation.
That's a very interesting point, and I can tell you directly, there were various efforts, since Brooklyn is all about revisionism now, there were efforts to try and put it out, but it's considered in the same category as Eastman Johnson's depictions of black people consuming watermelon. You know, no one's brave enough to put it out and really speak about, you know, what are we seeing, but boy, it's time that Mr. Roseland was put back up on the wall.
Well, and just a fascinating, as far as collections go, in the Museum of Fine Arts San Francisco, the gentleman counting, that was purchased by the Rockefellers in, I think, the 60s, and it was part of a gift given to that museum. So I can say, for example, people are still collecting it,
yeah.
But that's another object in a museum which is also not on display.
The Winslow Homer and Photography show that opens at Bowdoin soon has Winslow Homer's Caribbean.
Oh, okay.
Lots of them, and I'd be fascinated. There's a chapter on it by Dana Bird in the catalog, so I'll be curious how that fits into what was Winslow Homer thinking when he painted, because he'd also done so many Civil War scenes, and yeah, it's fascinating.
Great. All right. Well, we can think about more stuff. There is more to come. So thanks again to our wonderful speakers. Thank you to you, the audience. We are now going to have a nice leisurely lunch break. So reconvene here at 2:30 in the afternoon for 2 more papers. And I look forward to seeing you all then. So thanks again. Welcome back to the afternoon session here in the Made in New York Symposium, our annual symposium of the Parsons and Cooper Hewitt Graduate Student Program. So, as I mentioned earlier, we will actually have 2 papers now, but similar to the morning session, we'll have the papers, afterwards have a Q&A. If you have lingering questions from the morning, you can also bring those up as well. And we still have some fruit and Danish in the back if you're still hungry, so please enjoy. So, our first speaker this afternoon will be Anna Rasha. Anna is graduating this spring from the Parsons Cooper Hewitt MA program. Congratulations, Anna. Her research currently focuses on American jewelry of the 19th and 20th centuries. She has a BA in archaeology from Boston University and a graduate gemologist degree from the Gemological Institute of America. Anna's paper this afternoon, Dreiser and Company, Forgotten Jewelers of the Gilded Age, is drawn from her master's thesis on the history and development of one of the foremost jewelry houses of the 19th century city. So we'll pull it up and we can welcome Anna. There we go.
Thank you, Ethan. Can everyone hear me okay from here? Great. All right. Dreiser and Company was an American jewelry firm active circa 1868 to 1927 and an important contributor to the landscape of Gilded Age New York. The company was founded by Jacob and Gittel Dreiser, Jewish immigrants from Minsk, and later flourished under the direction of their son, Michael Dreiser. For the first decades of the 20th century, Dreiser and Company ranked among such elite houses as Cartier and Tiffany and Company, and boasted United States presidents and the nation's wealthiest businessmen as patrons. The firm was famous for their intricate garland-style platinum mountings, ability to assemble singular strands of pearls, and as procurers of large and rare gemstones. In addition to their jewelry business, the Dreiser family also invested in real estate and developed properties along Fifth Avenue. The untimely death of Michael Dreiser in 1921 was followed shortly by that of his father, and ultimately led to the liquidation of a business in its prime. An avid art collector, Michael Dreiser bequeathed a significant number of medieval and Renaissance works to the Metropolitan Museum of Art upon his passing. Appropriately, the first item that introduced me to this firm is housed in the American wing at the Met. Thank you, Beth, for pointing it out to me. It dates to about 1905, and it's this beautiful collar featuring a tiered cascade of large natural pearls, each surrounded by little diamond-studded garlands. It's the height of fashion for its day and fit for any queen of Edwardian society. And though the name Dreiser still encourages auction paddles to rise today, few outside the jewelry industry are aware of this company and family that left a legacy of art and architecture still present in the fabric of the 21st century city. So let's start at the beginning. Jacob Dreiser and Gittell Dreiser arrived to New York City in June of 1867 on an unknown ship. At the time of the voyage, the couple already had the first two of their 4 children, Fanny and Michael, Michael being only 1 month old at the time. 2 more daughters, Mary and Regina, would follow. To fund his family's new life, Jacob carried with him some Confederate currency that he had hoped to cash in for gold. This was in 1867, so finding themselves a bit late to achieve success through this endeavor, the couple decided to sell a small cachet of pearls and gems they had brought over hidden in the lining of their clothing. They had some experience in the gem business back in Minsk, and so were able to successfully use this modest stash as the little seed to grow a jewelry business. Little is known about their first years in America, but the federal census tells us that by 1870, they had landed at 300 East 34th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenues in Manhattan. Jacob's occupation is listed vaguely as peddler, and an anecdote from the memoirs of famous Victorian dandy Barry Wall gives us a clue about what exactly Jacob Dreiser peddled as a new arrival in this country. Quote, I remember Jacob Dreiser when he began his business career. He used to come to Delmonico's and other restaurants and offer us a new penknife for our old one plus 50 cents. He was always fair dealing, and soon the people from whom he had his consignments let him have pieces of jewelry on the same terms. From those beginnings, he built up a wonderful business. The peddling was indeed successful, and by the late 1870s, his city directory listings are upgraded to broker, and they were operating a business out of their new home at 177 Lexington Avenue. Now, it's interesting to note that while Jacob was initially identified as a diamond broker, the family's tastes and expertise lay more with colored gems and pearls. So while Jacob tended to the sales, Gittell was largely responsible for the buying and selling of gems and oversaw the cutting and polishing of rough material in a workshop she set up in her building's laundry room. Now, during these post-Civil War decades, in addition to top firms such as TB Starr, Marcus & Co., Black Star Frost, Tiffany & Company, and others, New York City was home to hundreds of rank-and-file jewelers, watchmakers, brokers, dealers, engravers, and lapidaries who were all eager to assist in the frenzied building of jewelry collections amongst new money families. This population of merchants and craftspeople represents the crowd from which the Dreisers would have to stand out. In 1880, Jacob Dreiser leased a room at 6 John Street, later moving next door to 8 John Street, both addresses in close proximity to the old Diamond District that was centered downtown around Maiden Lane. Outside of the offices, the curb market at Maiden Lane was bustling with hundreds of diamond merchants who habitually set up their spot on the sidewalk, exchanging untold quantities of cash and diamonds every year without ever stepping foot inside, which is kind of the same if you just go visit 47th Street today. It's still happening. So it's possible to imagine that Jacob Dreiser, armed with his knowledge of diamonds and an amicable nature, had earlier found the curb market an easy entry into the jewelry world of New York. Extant jewels from these early decades are scarce. One survival is this modest hair clip, which has since been converted into a pendant of seed pearls, diamonds, and yellow gold. And I'm not sure if you can see, but it's signed Jacob Dreiser on the reverse. It's the sort of item that would have been a moderate extravagance and would have probably been carried by any number of jewelers at the time, but it's with these little pieces that they're starting to build up their clientele and inventory. The earliest large purchase on record belongs to Adelaide Mont Bell, wife of wealthy cotton investor Isaac Bell. She paid $6,000 for an emerald and pearl necklace from Jacob Dreiser in 1876. She must have been somewhat of a champion of his, for the New Yorker remembered that Mrs. Bell's contemporaries all thought she was mad to make such a purchase from him. Her generosity paid off, however, for several decades later, she sold a single center stone from the necklace for $90,000, and a la Elizabeth Taylor used the proceeds to establish her own charity, the Bell Home for Gentlewomen in Nyack. Another high-profile purchaser of the 1870s was future President James Garfield. The New York Times reported that Garfield was a friend of Jacob Dreiser and commissioned a cameo portrait of himself to be mounted in diamonds in 1879. Sadly, he did not live to see the completion of the piece. In addition to the business advances taking place in Manhattan offices, by 1880, the Dreisers had a proper location at the Grand Union Hotel in the resort town of Saratoga Springs, New York. The family would keep a shop there during the summer season for the next 25 years. Jacob Dreiser and Company was well known to those who summered at Saratoga Springs. A local paper referred to the store as, quote, the pretty display of jewels in a window under the Grand Union, where women love to stop and tell one another which tiara or dog collar particularly suits their fancy, end quote. Reports of a genial shopping spree at the Saratoga location made national newspapers in 1888, and no doubt helped to spread the reputation of the firm. Feeling exceptionally generous after an evening of drinks and good cheer at the Grand Union, the wealthy dandy George Law bade Jacob Dreiser bring out trays of jewels for all his friends to choose from what they liked, and the selections were enviously reported in papers from California to Boston. The beneficiaries were apparently not the sentimental sort, though, for after a few rough days at the racetrack, they sold their gifts back to Jacob, who purchased them back at a discount and was able to realize a nice little profit from the whole venture. In 1884, the family was able to open their first Manhattan retail space at 1128 Broadway, which is that tall yellow building in the center. This map is from a few years after they've moved out, so it's no longer occupied by Dreiser in the image. The location, though, of the storefront was strategic, as it was just around the corner from Delmonico's restaurant, a favorite haunt of the 400, and, of course, a purported stop along Jacob's early peddling route. But now, instead of acting as trenchcoat salesman, Jacob was himself lunching at Delmonico's, where he would nonchalantly pull rare emeralds out of his pockets to entice other gentlemen diners back to his store. All along, Jacob and Gittell had been grooming their son Michael to take his place in the family business. His sister Mary Dreiser recounted, quote, "My mother went by herself to Europe to buy rough stones until my brother Michael was 17 years old, when she took him with her, taught him the conditions of the European market, and introduced him to the sellers of the foreign markets and instructed him how to buy," unquote. In 1892, the business moved again from the Broadway location to 292 Fifth Avenue and changed its name to J. Dreiser & Son to reflect Michael's growing role. The old mansion occupying the lot was torn down, and a new building was commissioned by Dreisers. It was designed by architects George Edward Harding and Gooch. The structure was supported by an iron frame and clad in a granite and limestone facade. It was furnished with modern amenities such as an elevator, steam heat, and electric light. Michael Dreiser was a success in his assumption of leadership roles in both jewelry and real estate arenas, and it was soon recognized that he had inherited his parents' talent in regards to pearls and gemstones. It was said that, quote, his extraordinary gift for remembering individual pearls served important uses in recognizing and identifying stolen pearls, even when they had been removed from their original mounting, unquote. Despite what must have been a very significant output of product, it is actually still quite rare to find items signed J. Dreiser & Son that can conclusively be dated to this period, which was about 1892 to 1906 of the company's history. A significant survival comes from First Lady Ida McKinley's diamond collection. It's a J. Dreiser & Son tiara featuring 2 diamond wings atop a golden circlet that can be rearranged and removed or worn as brooches. And you can see Mrs. McKinley wearing it right here. In 2014, this tiara actually appeared on the TV show Pawn Stars, of all places, and was purchased by the shop owner on camera for $43,000. Luckily, curators of the McKinley Presidential Library happened to see the episode and were subsequently able to acquire the tiara for their own collection. And that's where it lives today. Now, by 1906, the Dreisers were able to hire architects Warren and Wetmore of Grand Central Station fame to design a flagship store that still stands today on the southwest corner of 46th Street and 5th Avenue. The shortened company name of Dreiser & Co. was first used about this time, and it is by this name that the firm is most recognized today. The location at 46th Street was considered an aggressive move in the steady northward march of retail establishments. For example, that same year, 1906, Tiffany & Company had moved from their old-fashioned location at Union Square all the way up to 5th Ave and 37th Street. When Dreiser opened, the new Dreiser building opened in November of 1907, Menswear Daily described the store as, quote, the acme of luxurious fitting, end quote. The first floor facade was of black marble with gilt top Corinthian pilasters and large windows curtained in silk that displayed a few choice jewels. The upper 4 stories were clad in Indiana limestone, and the top floor originally housed the offices and workshops of Dreiser & Company's Parisian workmen, as they called them. The facade may look familiar to some, as it is directly inspired by Cartier's 1899 13 Rue de la Paix location in Paris. There are apparently no pretenses made about the source for the design, for the Record and Guide Real Estate report noted in 1907 that, quote, the new Dreiser building is modeled after that of Messrs. Cartier and Company, the famous jewelers. So everyone was on board with it. The interiors of the shop were a partnership between the firm Nelson of Paris, who was responsible for the Cornelius Vanderbilt house interiors, and Marcotte of New York City. Done in the French Renaissance style, quote, the rich carving and modeling of walls and ceiling produced at once upon prospective patrons the assurance of the firm's reliability and good taste, end quote. Dreiser also chose to eschew traditional display cases and instead chose, quote, hand-carved rosewood tables supporting inlaid cases of precious woods mounted in ormolu. The New York Herald Tribune described a shopper's experience, stating, quote, only a few small showcases featuring several of the Dreiser masterpieces suggested that the room might serve the purpose of business as well as pleasure. Occasionally, in odd corners among the luxurious draperies that swept to the ceiling would be inserted a minute retiring room. Within this discreet recess, a client could seek seclusion if she wished to indulge in the embarrassingly intimate process of making a purchase, unquote. The minimalist approach was a departure from other contemporary jewelers. Here we have the 1906 Tiffany building again, and you can see it's a rather cavernous space occupied by long counters filled with perhaps thousands of objects. Definitely not a discreet, intimate purchasing experience. Between 1910 and 1920, Dreiser & Co. expanded beyond New York with branches at the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago, the Colonnade Hotel in Magnolia, Massachusetts, the Jeanette Building at Palm Beach, Florida. Most extant jewelry dates to this era when Dreiser had reached the height of their success and fame. Their jewelry may be viewed as distinct for its craftsmanship, elevated interpretations of classic design tropes, deference and attention to fashion of the day, and use of rare and exceptional gemstones. For the most part, they created fashionable interpretations of traditional motifs, and their energies were directed towards perfecting jewels for elite individuals with conservative taste. Dreiser's output may be categorized into 2 general areas: jewelry that featured heritage pearls or singular gemstones, and design jewels where pearls and gems of still very nice quality were arranged and incorporated into larger patterns and forms. Dreiser pieces of the design category focus on highly stylized scroll work, flora, bowknots, tassels arranged in pierced openwork plaques, filigree vines, and festooned pendants. Unadorned metal surfaces are not present, and the little metal that is visible is for the most part decorated with engraving or mill-grain detailing. This elaborate aesthetic is known as the garland style and was based upon the hefty Georgian court jewels of the 18th century. Fine examples can be found in the sketchbooks of Marcel Banville, who was a principal designer at Dreiser from 1906 to World War I, at which point he moved back to his native France to participate in the war. A necklace dating circa 1912, you can see in this photograph right here, was designed by Banville when the garland style had reached its peak in terms of popularity and execution. It features a graceful, articulated pendant of diamonds and pearls arranged in platinum foliate piercework and finished with a fringe of pear-cut brilliant diamonds. The delicate lines that distinguish garland-style jewels from their Georgian ancestors would not have been achievable without the use of platinum, which was Dreiser and Company's metal of choice. Advances in torch technology made platinum a viable option for jewelers in the last decades of the 19th century. Its resilience to tarnish and incredible strength, even when worked into thin filaments, allowed for the intricate all-white jewels favored by Gilded Age elite. An article in the Lotus magazine from 1915 entitled Jewelry as Art features an enormous platinum corsage ornament by Dreiser and highlights the possibilities of platinum. The ornament is richly decorated with floral garlands and tassels of diamond and pearl and is described as pure Louis XV style. The platinum setting supports the elaborate pattern with minimal visual interference, and the Lotus also noted that, quote, it articulates with every movement of the body, thus becoming as if it were part of the wearer's personality. Dreiser and Company, of course, actively promoted the quality of their settings and creativity of their designers, but it was the jewelry falling into the heritage gemstone category that really captured the imagination of the proprietors and their clients. Unlike the previously discussed jewels, which relied upon intricately patterned metal framework for visual impact, when truly important gems were to be displayed, the setting was kept to a minimum to better highlight the singularity of the stone. Functional settings, chains, and clasps fashioned of platinum and perhaps embellished with minimal scrollwork flourishes or diamond accents were appropriately dignified for the important task of securing and displaying some of the Earth's rarest treasures. Pearls, of course, were the signature jewel of the Gilded Age and of Dreiser and Company in particular. Many publications note, in fact, that it was Jacob and Gittell Dreiser's affection and understanding of pearls that led to their popularity in the United States. This may be giving them a bit too much credit, but certainly Dreiser and other jewelers were able to capitalize on the American upper class's desire to emulate European nobility, who routinely wore pearls. By the start of the 20th century, they had certainly become de rigueur. Gemologist George Frederick Kuntz went so far as to state, quote, if one is a wearer of jewels, pearls are an absolute necessity. Indeed, they are as essential and indispensable for the wealthy as are houses, cars, houses, horses, or automobiles. The fame of Dreiser pearl strands was national, and in December of 1911, the Idaho Statesman and other syndicated newspapers published the article entitled Who'll Buy This $1 Million Necklace? It contains a 2-scale image of a magnificent Dreiser graduated pearl strand and also hypothesized at length about which wealthy woman would end up owning a rope so magnificent it was internally referred to as just the necklace. Michael Dreiser cheekily told the Statesman that, quote, anybody has a $100,000 necklace nowadays, unquote, but this $1 million strand was 10 years in the making and could never be put together again. He went on to hint at the origin of the pearls that made up the strand, stating, quote, some of these pearls have been well known in Spain. The troubles of the royal houses of Portugal have been associated with others. The pearl, you know, has a way of mixing itself up with the intimate dramas of life. It is a very human gem. The fate of this extraordinary piece is unknown, but James Buchanan Duke, the tobacco and electricity industrialist for whom Duke University was named, purchased a strand of pearls from Dreiser for his wife Nanaline Holt Inman for the not at all insignificant sum of $180,000, right around 1905. Nanaline is most likely wearing the Dreiser strand in a 1926 portrait by Alexius de Laszlo de Lombos. The importance of the strand is evident in that it was chosen as a feature of this portrait almost 2 decades after the original purchase. One of many other wealthy clients to frequent Dreiser and Company was Boston banker and sugar magnate William Spaulding. He purchased his wife, Katerina Fairley, this stunning pendant necklace featuring a 47.5-carat cushion-cut sapphire and a 26.98-carat old pair brilliant-cut diamond. The necklace itself, of course, is an unassuming bar-length chain with small diamond stations so as not to distract from the impressive size and color of the two featured gemstones. This piece was eventually bequeathed to the couple's daughter, Contessa Alicia Spalding, who carried it to Switzerland in a picnic basket when the Nazis invaded Italy. A Dreiser diamond that received a great deal of press coverage in recent years is this stunning 8.72 carat fancy vivid purplish pink cushion cut that appeared on the auction block in 2015 after nearly 70 years in a bank vault. This exceedingly rare gemstone was purchased by Dreiser in 1904 at an auction of Princess Matilda Bonaparte's jewels, and then mounted in a ring and sold to corrupt Montana senator and mining magnate William Andrews Clark Sr., one of the richest men in the United States. The stone was bequeathed to his youngest daughter, Huguette, who famously lived as a recluse in her New York City apartment and voluntarily in hospitals from the 1930s until her death in 2011, at which point the jewel was rediscovered and auctioned. Dreiser did not limit their output, though, to precious stones and created settings for semi-precious specimens as well. We have a couple beautiful examples here. We have a platinum piercework brooch from about 1920 that features this black opal that's accented by little sapphires. We have a negligee pendant featuring two large pear-cut aquamarines suspended from a little diamond halo on barely there platinum chains. More substantially, we have a 26-carat bottle green baguette-cut tourmaline that's bordered by that great architectural diamond fringe frame. Jade, of course, was also a favorite of Dreiser and Company, a stately Art Deco ring by the firm that we have up here features a impeccable cabochon of apple green jadeite set into a minimal platinum mounting that's also accented by sapphires and diamonds. And then they also did often feature carved Eastern jades as the focal piece of a jewel, and this one has a really great little oval platinum frame around a carved nephrite peony. So Tiffany, of course, is famous for developing the unadorned 6-prong solitaire mounting, the Tiffany setting, the ubiquitous clip art engagement ring of today. And in a similar fashion, it's apparent that a signature Dreiser engagement ring design was developed by the firm. Their setting, crafted in platinum, featured a 4-prong head atop a narrow knife edge band, embellished with diamond pave and milligrane detailing. Further pave work adorned the gallery, which is nice because that would be only visible to the wearer. So it's a cool little secret touch. And unlike the Tiffany setting, the Dreiser setting was not intended exclusively for diamonds, but for any distinguished gemstone. First Lady Edith Wilson's engagement ring was purchased from Dreiser in 1915, and as can be seen in her official portrait, her diamond is set in this style or similar. Another important commission was a hunting knife made in 1909 as a gift to former President Theodore Roosevelt from New York Supreme Court Justice James W. Girard. It's quite unlike any of the objects discussed thus far. The Dreiser & Company hilt, with a focus on yellow gold and asymmetrical natural imagery, is definitely a departure from their standard repertoire and likely would not have been associated with them if this piece were to be unsigned. It is of interest beyond just its presidential provenance, as it illustrates the capabilities of Dreiser craftsmen to successfully execute work outside of the company's normal design vocabulary. The nuance and creativity of this piece and exactness of execution are certainly a testament to the skill of early 20th century goldsmiths. Now, paying out of Dreiser & Company investors and the disposal of Dreiser real estate holdings began almost immediately after Michael and Jacob Dreiser were buried in the summer of 1921. 5 years later, Edwin J. Case, who was acting president after Michael passed away, announced that the last day of business would be on February 28, 1927. An executor of Jacob and Michael's estates informed the New York Times, quote, "The family was agreed that the retirement of the Dreiser firm should be complete. This decision was reached for sentimental reasons and out of respect to the memory of the founder of the business, Jacob Dreiser, and his son Michael," unquote. Aside from sentimental reasons for the closure, it appears the public's confidence in the firm was largely weighted on the involvement of Michael Dreiser himself. Stocks had immediately depreciated by 50% upon his death, and the net profit had dropped from just over $1.2 million in 1920 to $148,000 in 1921. The poet Leslie Nelson Jennings attended the final sale days in 1927 and expressed the incredulity felt by many who had grown up knowing Dreiser & Co. as an unmovable stalwart of the luxury industry in New York. And if you'll indulge me, a little excerpt. What can have happened here, alas? Crowds rush past the portals, bold as brass, and where soft-spoken experts made a ritual of the goldsmith's trade, efficient clerks let people paw what once was viewed with proper awe. So today, the gilt marble halls of the 1906 Dreiser & Company building have long since been gutted. Now the upper floors house office space, and the ground floor most recently became the Fifth Avenue flagship of Oakley sunglasses. The first floor facade of black marble and gold detailing was removed by the current tenants about 3 years ago. The north-facing facade on 46th Street, which is pictured here, which once featured silk-draped glass windows, is now completely covered by a striated stucco wrap, also installed by the sunglasses chain. But look up above the big neon Oakley, Warren & Wetmore's carefully proportioned Corinthian pilasters and wide windows framed by elegant wrought iron remain. The building stands as a distinguished and attractive example of the grand old New York architecture that still exists quietly above the commercial street-level cladding. Dreiser jewels, as demonstrated by Huguette Clark's fabulous pink diamond, still garner international press and fetch astronomical sums. Even without a rare and important center stone, fine Dreiser pieces are sought after by dealers and collectors. More recently than the Clark Pink, this Dreiser & Company pendant necklace appeared at auction, I think last October. Yeah. So this platinum jewel is strung with a mesh of seed pearls and is set with less than 2 carats of diamonds, but it achieved a price well beyond the intrinsic value of the gems. The artistry of the setting is both exemplary of its era and timeless. The Dreiser name still carries weight in the marketplace, and their aesthetic sensibilities remain beautiful in this century. Jacob, Giddel, and their 4 children are all laid to rest in a family mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, if you want to go visit them. The domed octagonal structure is built of white limestone. The intricate iron doors are flanked by Doric columns and bordered by carved garlands of leaves and ribbons. A stained glass window in the medieval style lets in light. It is a fitting monument to a family whose pursuit of success through beauty and art surely warrants a more prominent place on the stage of New York City history. Thank you.
Now, I guess finally today, we have Jeffrey McCullough. Jeffrey is a recent graduate of our MA program here at Parsons Cooper Hewitt. His professional background is in interior design, and his academic work focuses on American craft history, especially quilts, and the history of interior design. His paper today is entitled "A Collection Grows in Brooklyn" and deals with a large and varied collection of American design and decorative arts once belonging to 2 wealthy sisters living in Brooklyn Heights. It grows out of discoveries he made while researching a quilt in the Cooper Hewitt's collection and explores these New York lives through their material goods. Jeffrey?
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you to the selection committee for asking me to present today. I also want to say a big thank you to the History of Design and Curatorial Studies program in Cooper Hewitt, because it's the access that students have to the collection that led to everything that I am presenting to you today. So we'll get started. Many historians and connoisseurs focus on the high-end, bold name makers and designers, and the bold name families who owned items by those well-known, often written about and exhibited makers and designers. The quest to discover new sides and twists and turns on these topics seems to completely absorb and enrapture us, myself included. At times, it feels like we repeat the same names over and over again. My primary research focus for the last few years has been American quilts. The most challenging aspect of quilt research is that in many cases, there is no way of knowing who the maker is. Often, it actually doesn't really matter who made it, but it is always a plus and very exciting when that information can be learned. Other than the quilt pattern, which can help identify both the era and geographic location of the making, the point of entry in terms of research is who owned it, and if it has been donated to a collection, from whose estate did it come. And that is how I arrived at my topic for today with this quilt. Last fall, I began an independent study of 20 American quilts in the collection of Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. Only 2 of the 20 had a file, and none of the 20 had ever been exhibited. So I was truly starting from scratch. And for this researcher, that's an absolutely wonderful place to begin. This quilt, the one behind me, is not a spectacular quilt. It's charming, it's sweet, but there isn't anything about it that is unusual in pattern, and it doesn't offer any new information on patterns or quilting techniques. It does happen to be in great shape, probably because it's been in climate-controlled storage with archival protection for 50-plus years. It's special because it's a child's quilt, rather than a quilt made for an adult-sized bed, showing that even children deserved a handmade blanket by a talented, seasoned quilter. And it's important because it represents the textile collection of the maker, and that it came into Cooper Hewitt's collection along with 250 remnants of quilting fabrics, very similar in scale and pattern as those used to make this quilt, and 3 sewing bags that were used by the maker. This evidence allowed me to assert that the quilt was made by the donor, and most likely, because the time that it was made aligns with her birth, it was made for the heir of the donor's estate, who facilitated the placement of the quilt and many other objects in Cooper Hewitt's collection. Nearly all of the 200-plus fabrics that came into the collection are of very similar scale, weight, and patterns as the fabrics here. For me as a historian, what is most fantastic about the quilt is that it led me to Elizabeth C. and Sarah B. Russell, sisters who lived from childhood to death in the same house in Brooklyn Heights. Either Elizabeth or Sarah, or perhaps both working together, made this quilt, and it is just one of many items at our disposal to study how a collection grew in Brooklyn at 236 Henry Street, the Russell family's house, and how the legacy of the Russell family can live on if a historian and curator chooses for it to live. Adrian Forty points out in Objects of Desire, Design and Society since 1750 that, quote, the history of architecture and design is full of attempts to make sense of buildings and objects through the careers, ideas, and theories of known designers, end quote. I see the Russell Project as a chance to look at design through the lens of how a family enjoyed and used their possessions at home in Brooklyn with no bold-faced names attached. While the house still stands, and you can see it, it's the one right on the corner with the brick facade facing Henry Street and the neutral-colored facade facing Girolamo Street. While the house still stands at the corner of Henry and Girolamo Streets, it is now divided into apartments. With neither sister ever marrying, Elizabeth and Sarah's possessions commingled while they were both alive, and after Elizabeth's death in 1939, with the exception of a few items that were bequeathed to friends, Sarah presided over the collection and added to it until her death in 1955. Mary Kenway, the daughter of very close family friends and Brooklyn neighbors of the Russell sisters, inherited Sarah Russell's estate. Thankfully, Kenway saw to it that most of the Russell sisters' objects made their way into museum collections. When I discovered that all of these items live in New York, the idea was born of one day recreating the life lived by this upper middle class Brooklyn family. Cooper Hewitt alone has 585 objects. The Metropolitan Museum has 54 objects, which are mostly fashion, that was originally donated to the Brooklyn Museum and then went to the Costume Institute at the Met. The Brooklyn Museum still has a couple of items, both children's booties, and Columbia University's rare book collection holds 8 rare children's books. So nearly 650 objects of the Russell sisters survive in collections. So who is the Russell family that lived in this house? Elizabeth Russell was born in 1850. When she died at 89, her obituary that ran in the Brooklyn Eagle newspaper in April of 1939 was titled, quote, Miss E.C. Russell of pioneer stock, lifelong resident of Borough, descended from Long Island settlers, end quote. I will read part of her obituary now. She, quote, she was a daughter of the late William Sidney Smith Russell and Mrs. Rebecca Carew Russell. Her maternal grandfather was Ebenezer Carew of Norwich, Connecticut, a descendant of one of the founders of that town. On her father's side, she was descended from William Smith, an early British governor of Tangier, to whom was granted the manor of St. George on Long Island. That grant, made early in the 18th century, was one of the last in what is now New York State. It ran from what is now Smith's Point to Yaphank and north across Long Island. The old house of Longwood was built on part of that land. Miss Russell was educated in Brooklyn private schools and at Miss Porter's School at Farmington, Connecticut, end quote. The only survivor listed in the obituary was Sarah B. Russell, and that is because their only other sibling, a brother, had died in the 1920s. So when Elizabeth Russell passed away, truly the only because she didn't have children, her brother never married and had children, the only family member left was Sarah. When Sarah Buckingham Russell, who was born in 1864, died in 1955, her obituary ran in the New York Times and repeated the same family lineage information as Elizabeth's. The lives of the Russell sisters were recorded frequently by Brooklyn newspapers. Through these sources, we know that they traveled quite a lot. For example, in 1923, it was reported that they spent July in East Hampton and, quote, will motor up to Marblehead, Massachusetts to spend August, end quote. We also know that they were charitable, supporting several organizations and institutions, including the Brooklyn Holman Association, which raised money for rural nursing care, the Sheltering Arms Children's Service, Carnegie Hall, and the Brooklyn Institute of Arts, now the Brooklyn Museum. And what aspects of the Russell sisters' home and life live on today? In addition to the child's quilt, which might have been made for Mary M. Kenway, there are two adult-sized bed coverings seen here, both white matelassé coverlets. While neither is in great shape, we at least know the type of bedding that was used by the sisters, and these are both mid-19th century. So they would have been used by their parents, most likely prior to them. The Russell house was large, many-roomed, and it is clear that the sisters liked wallpaper because there are nearly a dozen wallpaper remnants in Cooper Hewitt's collection, mostly of English or French origin, and ranging from mid to late 19th century. Remember the lightness and color and floral pattern of these two, as they will relate to an image later in my presentation. And there are these three wallpapers in Cooper Hewitt's collection, a bit more formal than the previous ones. There are carpet and rug remnants at Cooper Hewitt, 8 total. These are 2 of them. And there are decorative arts of all kinds in Cooper Hewitt's collection: china, ceramics, porcelain, glass, desk accessories like the shell box on the bottom left and the paperweight on the bottom right, sets of plates, sets of vases. And then at the Met, there's the fashion, including 1850s/1860s children's clothes, seen here, which date to the years that the sisters were young. And hats of all styles and for all seasons. The bonnet in the center is dated 1845. The hat on the right is dated 1922. And please remember the hat on the left, a cap actually, because it will also relate to an image that we look at later in my presentation. It's dated 1818 by the Met, so it also would have been inherited from a previous generation. There's a lot of formal and evening attire. In 1956, soon after Sarah Russell's death, the 100th anniversary of the Charity Ball in New York was held at the Plaza. The highlight of the evening was, quote, a tableau presented in the setting of a Victorian drawing room of the period of 1856. Participants in the tableau wore gowns of the period of 1856, lent for the occasion by the Costume Institute of the Brooklyn Museum. The gowns had been worn originally by members of their families and were presented to the museum by Mrs. Edwin Carrington Ward, Mrs. Clarence A. Martin, and Miss Sarah B. Russell. The evening coat, cape, and evening dress behind me now are items that at the time of the ball would have been already in the Costume Institute at Brooklyn. So it is quite possible that one of these, most likely the evening dress on the far right, was worn at that tableau. And the Met has a parasol from 1850 to 60, socks, many pairs of socks, more than just these plaid ones, and even pajamas, in more than these pajamas, from the late 19th century. And there is fine art. These 2 harbor scenes, both dated 1840 by unknown artists, are in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, and the one on the left is currently on view in the American wing. And there are many, many prints and drawings. primarily French and of ladies' fashion, like the one seen here, which solidifies the Russell sisters' interest in fashion and sewing. There are 3 other examples. It is quite clear from the collection that grew in Brooklyn that the sisters had a love of history. That shows in the memorabilia, which includes a memorial medal of the founding of America and a program and medal from the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. Both of those are seen here. And there are 5 Centennial Exhibition commemorative plaques, each representing buildings at the exhibition in Philadelphia. 2 of those are shown here. They represent buildings that were erected for the Centennial. The Agricultural Hall on the left was the 3rd largest structure at the event and was designed by James Windrum. And the Machinery Hall on the right was the 2nd largest structure at the Centennial Exhibition, and it was designed by Joseph M. Wilson and Henry Pettit. We know how they spent their leisure time. In addition to their travels, they played games and they read. And even their games, which you can see here, those are playing cards on the left, and that's actually the cover of a game box in the background. Even their games represent their quest for knowledge and love of history. We have the book on the left that accompanied one of their games, The Directions and Story of Philosopher's Travels, or Game of Nations. And on the right, in Columbia's rare book collection, is one of the children's books. This one is titled Trotty's Wedding Tour and Storybook, and it's by Elizabeth Stewart Phelps, and it dates to 1874. And most important, we even know how they decorated their Christmas tree. Cooper Hewitt holds a massive amount of ornaments. And by the way, many of them are made of either sugar or dough. Conservation nightmare, perhaps, and likely never see the light of day again. The one in the bottom right is made of paper. The other 3 are not. They're made of sugar or dough. So what don't we have to represent the life and collection of the Russell sisters? Other than this one tiny footstool, there is no furniture, and there is no lighting of any kind. And while that might seem problematic at first, we have 2 Wallace Nutting images from the collection at Cooper Hewitt that give us an insight on the type of interior scene that Elizabeth and Sarah Russell enjoyed. Here's one called At the Fender. The lady, sitting in a Windsor chair, sewing, wears a cap very similar to the one that I pointed out earlier that the Russell sisters gave to the Met. And the footstool, though round and not rectangular, isn't dissimilar to the one at Cooper Hewitt. And it turns out that the Russell sisters owned Windsor chairs. This is known from Elizabeth Russell's will, which I have studied every word of. We know that they had a dark wood rocking chair that had belonged to their great-grandmother Russell. A gilt clock, please note that there is a major clock on the mantle, from Uncle Israel Russell, and a mahogany tilt-top round table, not unlike the one shown against the wall, the round table with the pedestal base. Their table had belonged to Grandmother Russell. All of those items were left to family friends, and I do know to whom they all went. And in this Wallace Nutting image, titled Dainty China, we see a room with a wallpaper not unlike some of those in Cooper Hewitt's collection. We see china and silver candlesticks. Elizabeth Russell's will details all of the silver and china that she gave to others. In fact, her will gives descriptions that any curator would love to have. Quote, mahogany table with carved posts and feet with leaves that drop, given by Grandfather Russell. Tray embroidered on white satin. My father's bureau without mirror and with heavy plain pillars and top with 3 small drawers. 2 embroidered pictures made by Grandmother Russell, one in an oval wooden frame and the other in a square gilt frame with the inscription, Thy will be done. The descriptions that she wrote go on, detailing every item. So I don't see it as so far-fetched to one day accurately recreate a late 19th, early 20th century Brooklyn Heights life of 2 sisters who collected, who were generous with their funds and who seemed to quite enjoy life. As our keynote speaker said last night, and I quote, it's about all of the objects that are here and working out from an object in a material culture way to find and tell the stories that are given to us by the objects, end quote. The family doesn't have to be the Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, DuPonts, or another bold-faced name, and the objects don't have to be prized because of their maker for the story to be worthy of telling. We are a young country, and there's still much to learn about how people lived in places like Brooklyn and others, areas that get overshadowed and understudied by neighboring cities. I will close with an image of an object from the Russell Sisters collection. This is a card. It's actually part of a memory game. And it reads, Air, Mozart's new step waltz. A flower whose perfume all is past. A sky with dark clouds overcast. An eagle with a broken wing. A lute with many a broken string. A harp without a single tone, whose every harmony is flown. A tree with leaves all dead and sere. Old maid are emblems of thee here. As historians, I see it as our job to keep the scent of the flower alive, remember when the eagle's wings allowed him to soar, celebrate when the tones and harmony were perfect and all the leaves were great shades of green. For these old maids, that derogatory term used to describe unmarried women, the Russell Sisters, life can be represented and celebrated through the objects that live on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. So again, we will have open up the floor to questions. Maybe actually this time I'll ask Jeffrey and Anna to come sit up here so you can share the microphone. I'll put our fancy backdrop up again.
We're the pros. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Anna. That was fabulous. Is this on? Yeah. Did you find a lot of evidence of Dreiser selling jewelry made by other firms or making jewelry for other firms?
Not of making jewelry for other firms, but absolutely retailing pieces made by others. There's one rather fabulous necklace that is in a Dreiser box. I think you've probably seen it,
I
like
did.
the Cascade tourmaline one that has French maker's marks, and they
Yes.
didn't sign it, so they probably imported that as a whole piece. And then there's also lots of gentlemen's dress sets that are made, that have the Larder and Company of Newark manufacturer stamp on them. So I imagine there was also lots of other relationships of that nature, which was pretty standard for big houses like that of the time.
Thank you both so much. Those were just two really great presentations. My question's for Jeffrey, though. Do you have a favorite object in the collection?
I do, and I actually, I find the little paperweight really spectacularly beautiful, but also the evening coat that was part of the trio and the blue cape next to it. The blue cape is spectacular, and I'm not a fashion guy at all, but while I've worked on this project, I've paid attention more to fashion than I ever have. But I find that particularly those three objects, the little paperweight, the evening coat, and the blue cape.
Actually, just a quick question to Jeffrey again. Did you get the sense that there were some of those objects that were made by the sisters? I was thinking of maybe that shell box. Part of
Probably the quilt, definitely.
Okay.
That quilt that I started with was absolutely made by them. There's one more quilt in the collection that's in really terrible shape, but it was probably made by them. And yes, I think some of the smaller objects, I think some of the ornaments were also probably made
that makes sense.
by them as well. Yeah, even though they never had children, they had such a great relationship with Mary Kenway that it seems that they engaged with her doing really fun projects. So she was definitely, Mary Kenway was a part of their life from her birth to death as well. We should be very grateful to Mary Kenway for getting all the objects here.
Were there any diaries?
There are no diaries, but the will reads like a diary.
It seemed like that.
And there are many, many more newspaper coverings. I just picked one. There are many. Their lives were covered a fair amount. Yeah, I mean, I know about trips they took just up to Connecticut for the day to see someone, or they really were sort of tracked. The Mrs. It always said the Mrs. Russell.
It's sort of similar to, did they collect on their own? I mean, would they
Yeah.
collect
Oh yeah,
in terms of,
absolutely.
like,
That's why I find it so fascinating is that they inherited so many objects, but they just continued to build the collection. So they were really into this project. I mean, it was not, that house became their life. I mean, all of those wallpapers that I showed would have been papers and that they did in their lifetime.
sort of interesting to look at the Hewitt sisters and the Cohn sisters, and right?
Right, who all have big names, but the poor Russell sisters, who, because they had no children, the family name died, and...
But you're going to make them a big name.
Well, I
right?
hope.
So, and Anna, with the Dreisers, there were, the children lived on, right? So did they inherit some of these pieces, or was everything sold as part of the business?
So they had 4 children. Michael, of course,
Right,
passed
had
away. He had 2 sons. Their mother remarried twice, actually, and she married into European nobility. So the Michael Dreiser's 2 sons went on and actually became involved in sort of Scottish nationalist movements and had nothing to do with jewelry. The 3 daughters, I think they were all rather lucky in love, and actually or unlucky in love, I should say, and some of the only personal writings I have are from court records of divorce proceedings, which all happened in the early 1890s, so you can imagine what a scandal it was. But sorry to make a long answer short, the family did not really continue in the jewelry business. The one other grandchild was the world's first gourmet, Maurice Dreiser, and he traveled around the world in search of the perfect steak. And he was going to write a book about it, but he never did and failed to get all the steaks written off as business expenses on his taxes. So they sold much of their inventory to the public during that liquidation sale, and also Cartier actually is recorded as having purchased a large majority of the leftover inventory and then incorporating it into their own list.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
To both of you.
So Anna, so Dreiser is not well known, and you have indeed helped towards making them better known. So the Metropolitan has a piece. Are there any other in public collections around there?
That, and Beth, correct me if I'm wrong, the Met necklace is the only item of jewelry I'm aware of. And then, of course, they have about 3 dozen medieval and Renaissance artworks that were donated by Michael Dreiser. But that necklace that I showed in the beginning is the only piece I'm aware of that's in a public collection.
And can you speculate on why that is so?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is just because since the family really didn't have much interest in sort of continuing the name, I think they sort of fell off people's radar rather quickly in that sense. Also, as I was saying, for some of their more important pieces, the gemstones in there are fabulous, world-class, still at the top of the market today. So I imagine a lot has sort of been taken apart and sold as other pieces.
And just stylistically, it's not something that
it's not
people
very
have focused on.
Yeah, it's like I was saying, it's very conservative, high Edwardian taste, and there's not anything very avant-garde about a lot of their pieces. So because of that, I think probably better known names when people are seeking to build their collections, they're going to look for a Cartier or a Tiffany piece to typify that period.
And can you speculate on Michael's collecting habits?
Yeah, absolutely. He followed a pretty typical pattern of wealthy gentlemen of that era, which was...
Of wealthy gentlemen of what persuasion in particular?
Are you looking for a connection to the Rothschild family, or?
Yeah, it's just it's just Jewish taste, isn't it?
No
slur intended. No,
Sure.
but it's very interesting
Yeah.
that's clearly, I think, what he's emulating.
Yeah, I believe.
As
I
one
don't
would
think
expect.
it's too different than what J.P. Morgan or anybody else was collecting at the time. It's a lot of sculpture. I'm not sure exactly, but I'd bet some of the column toppers at the cloisters maybe are Michael Dreiser pieces. But yeah, he was definitely really into that trend of just establishing your own status by collecting pieces of European art from those eras.
Can I just answer Barry's question a little bit?
Yes, please.
I think maybe it's different for your museum, but I don't think a lot of women especially who've inherited jewelry, think about giving it to museums when it's, so Belle Epoque. And if they don't know who Dreiser is, maybe if it were Cartier or Tiffany, they would, but I think that's part of the problem. So a museum would have to go out seeking it, yeah. And then it's paying a lot of money for a pink diamond ring.
Yeah, no, and that's fair. If you saw a lot of the images I showed were from auction houses and galleries, because that's where this stuff pops up. Often, but not all. I think everything I showed is signed by them. They have a couple different signatures, but there are also plenty of pieces that are attributed to them because it comes with its original case and the object itself isn't signed, or perhaps the clasp has been replaced or the ring has been resized or something that took away the signature.
So thanks again for everyone for coming. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you, Barry, for that great introduction last night. Thank you to Peter Kenny, who unfortunately couldn't make it back. And I hope this has sparked interest in further papers and projects and research and connections amongst scholars, and that's what we strive to do here in the master's program. So have a great weekend, everyone. Enjoy the city.